How many kids would you torture to save your mother? Not in theory, not as a number. Imagine it right now. You're in a room. It's quiet. Your mother is lying on a table. She's sedated, unconscious, dying, and the only way to stop it is through another room. A door you don't want to open, because behind it is a child, alone, frightened, maybe 6 years old, maybe younger. And beside them, a set of instructions, clear, specific. You must cause pain, real pain, not simulated, not brief, long enough, severe enough. And when it's done, your mother will wake up, alive, safe, smiling. She'll never know what you did. No one will, just you. Would you do it? Most people recoil. They don't even want to imagine it. They say no immediately. But that's not honesty. That's fear. Fear of what the answer might reveal. So let's not ask if you would. Let's ask how many. Start with one. One child. 10 minutes of agony. Your mother survives. It's horrible, but it's clear. One for one. Maybe you tell yourself, it's worth it. Maybe you cry, shake, vomit, but you still do it. And then another door opens. Another child. The same choice, same outcome. Another 10 minutes. Another scream. Another scar. But your mother still lives, and she still doesn't know. No one does. Just you. You tell yourself, this is the last time. You hope it is. But then another door opens. And then another. And each time, the same calculation. One more child. One more hour. Your mother stays alive. Do you stop, or do you keep going? Because now you're not choosing between morality and love. You're choosing between discomfort and permanence. Between short pain for a stranger and continued life for someone who made you, loved you. You start bargaining. Maybe it matters if the child is older or less innocent. Maybe you imagine they'll recover, that the damage isn't permanent, that children are resilient. You start searching for justifications, any way to make it bearable. But now think about this. What if someone offered you the reverse? What if the cost was your pain, your body, your suffering? Would you volunteer, without hesitation, for your mother's life? Most people would say yes, without limits, anything, any amount of suffering. So then ask yourself honestly, why is it harder when the pain isn't yours? Why does the math change? You say you love her more than anyone. You say you'd die for her. So why not let someone else suffer if it means she lives? Because now you're realizing something you didn't want to face. That pain, when it's yours, feels noble. But when it's someone else's, it feels cruel, even if the logic is the same. So the question deepens. How many kids would you torture? Not out of hatred, not for pleasure, just to keep one person alive, one person you love more than anyone. 5, 10, 100. Would it matter if you never saw their faces? If the doors never opened? If all you heard was silence, and then the sound of your mother breathing again? And what if she asked you not to, begged you not to? Would you obey her wishes, even if it meant watching her die? Or would you betray her morals to preserve her body? Because that's what this is. Not a question about children or torture. It's a question about who you become when love demands cruelty. When doing the right thing feels wrong and doing the wrong thing feels necessary. You want to believe there's a line you wouldn't cross. But lines drawn in pain are easy to erase. One scream at a time, one moment of hesitation, silenced by someone you can't bear to lose. You don't want to answer. You want to change the question. Redefine the terms. Look away. But that doesn't change the truth. The question remains, quietly. How many kids would you torture to save your mother? And are you sure the number isn't already more than 0? Imagine finding out that the person who embezzled millions from a charity is the same one who hosted the annual fundraiser with a smile so kind. It made people cry, not out of suspicion, but out of admiration. You think you'd see it coming, that there'd be a look, a tone, something off about them. But what if there isn't? What if the happiest people you know, the warmest, most generous, most socially admired, are the ones committing the quietest crimes? Not the violent ones, not the messy ones, the silent ones. The ones that don't even feel like crimes until years later, when the damage has already spread too far to trace back. These people are never caught breaking into houses or holding a gun. They're in meetings, hosting dinners, giving advice, smiling with their whole face. They say they believe in kindness, in integrity, in making the world better. And maybe they do, but alongside that belief is something else, something quieter. A private exception they make for themselves, just one shortcut, one small breach, justified by stress, by necessity, by something they think they deserve. And then they keep going, not because they're heartless, but because they don't feel like criminals. They feel like people doing what they have to do. Good people, still good, still better than most. That's the part that stings. They don't see themselves as evil. They're not plotting anything. They're just managing things, just making choices, the same way everyone does. And because they smile, because they give generously, because they say all the right things in public, no one notices the boundary they crossed in private. Even they don't notice it at first. But over time, that small exception becomes a habit. That habit becomes a pattern. And the pattern becomes a kind of private identity. A dual life, hidden behind a mask of joy. A version of themselves they never speak about. Not even to themselves. They become skilled at compartmentalization, at detaching the version of themselves that's warm and generous from the version that manipulates, deceives, takes. And slowly, without meaning to, they begin to believe the mask is the real face, that the joy they show others is proof of their goodness, that the damage they cause doesn't really count. Because how could someone who smiles like that be a bad person? You might think the truly dangerous people are angry, bitter, filled with rage. But that kind of violence is visible. It draws attention. It gives you something to react to, something to resist. The people you can't resist are the ones who make you feel safe. The ones who never raise their voice, never demand too much, never seem threatening. They disarm you completely. So when they finally ask for something a little unethical, a little manipulative, you don't even think to question it. You feel flattered, trusted, chosen, and maybe that's why these crimes go unnoticed for so long. Because they don't feel like crimes. They feel like relationships, like loyalty, like small favors. They're embedded in the texture of normal life, soft, polite, charming. And by the time you realize what's happened, it's already too late to untangle the truth. But here's the harder part. It's not just other people. It's you, too. If you've ever cut corners, told a comforting lie, taken advantage of someone's trust just a little, you've already touched this pattern. You've already proven that morality isn't a line you refuse to cross. It's a set of stories you tell yourself to feel clean. And when those stories are built on joy, on generosity, on smiling reassurance, it becomes nearly impossible to see the harm, let alone stop it. Because if you believe you're one of the good ones, then every exception you make feels justifiable. You're not doing it for selfish reasons. You're doing it to keep things going, to protect people, to avoid unnecessary conflict. That's how it begins. And once you've convinced yourself of that, once your happiness is tied to the image of being good, it becomes incredibly easy to ignore what you're actually doing. Even as the damage grows, even as people begin to suffer, You won't feel guilt. Not at first. You'll feel misunderstood, overburdened, maybe even victimized, because in your mind, you're still the good one, still the one who's trying their best. And maybe you are. Maybe that's what makes this so hard to see. That the happiest people, the ones who make us feel safe, seen, supported, might be the ones hurting us most. And they might not even know they're doing it. Not until everything around them falls apart. And even then, maybe not. Would you ever admit how good it feels? Not just to win, not just to succeed, but to win at someone else's expense, to succeed while someone else fails, to rise while someone else falls. There's a part of your brain, a small silent part, that lights up when you see someone weaker stumble, when you see them humiliated, excluded, hurt. You don't talk about it. You tell yourself you're above it, but the reaction is there, a flicker of satisfaction, a subtle reward. It's not the kind of pleasure you celebrate. It doesn't make you smile, but it lingers. It reinforces. It teaches you something quietly, without words, that hurting the weak, even in small ways, feels good. You notice it in school, even as a child, the way the unpopular kid gets ignored, the way the one who stutters gets laughed at, and somehow being part of the group doing the laughing feels like safety, like strength. You didn't have to be cruel to feel it, you just had to watch, just had to not intervene. Your brain rewards you anyway. Later, it's more subtle. A co-worker makes a mistake in front of your boss. A stranger struggles to articulate a thought. Someone reveals a vulnerability, and you feel the tiniest pulse of superiority. You wouldn't say it out loud, but it's there, a low hum of pleasure, telling you that you are not them, that you are better, that you're on higher ground. You think you're kind, empathetic. But when someone fails and it's not your fault, why does it feel so strangely satisfying? Why does another's weakness make you feel, however briefly, stronger? It's because your brain evolved for hierarchy, for dominance, for advantage. Even when you believe in compassion, equality, fairness, there's an older system running underneath, one that watches others fall and sees opportunity. And when that reward circuit activates, it teaches you over time. It shapes your habits. You get a small reward for distancing yourself from the weak, for aligning with strength, for laughing along, for looking away. You don't think you're cruel, but every time you fail to stand up, your brain is reinforcing the lesson. Cruelty protects you, indifference benefits you, and kindness costs. The real damage isn't when someone is hurt, it's when you feel rewarded for not helping. Because then it's not just a lapse, it becomes strategy. It becomes the path of least resistance. You stop speaking up. You start avoiding the outcast. You start enjoying the moments when someone else is the target. You feel safer when attention isn't on you, and that safety becomes addictive. You don't have to be the one inflicting pain. You just have to be near it. Just close enough to benefit, far enough to deny responsibility. And if you repeat that pattern enough, you begin to forget how to be anything else. What begins as instinct turns into preference. You prefer environments where someone else is weaker, where someone else is struggling, because it gives you contrast, certainty, something to define yourself against. And then you notice something even darker. When there's no one visibly failing, you start to feel uncomfortable, exposed, insecure. You need someone beneath you to feel stable, to feel safe. And if no one else is failing, your mind begins to turn on itself. You look for someone to diminish, to judge, to reject, just to recalibrate your place, just to feel okay. And maybe, sometimes, you make someone else weak, subtly, quietly. You interrupt them. You correct them. You roll your eyes or speak over them. Not because you hate them, but because your brain is seeking relief. Because it wants to know you're not at the bottom. Because it wants the hit of reassurance that comes from pushing someone gently just below you. And if you're honest, you've seen others do the same. People you respect, people you like, laughing at someone's expense, ignoring someone's pain, rewarded socially and neurologically for reinforcing hierarchy. And it works. It binds groups together. It creates order. But it leaves certain people outside, and your brain barely notices, or worse, enjoys it. You tell yourself it's not evil, you're not violent, you're not abusive, you're just normal. But if normal means benefiting from another's pain, from their shame, from their weakness, what does that say about normal? What if you could measure every small moment where you felt stronger because someone else felt small? What if each of those moments left a mark, not on them, but on you? Would you see the pattern? Would you see who you've become? And would you notice how much of your identity, your confidence, your peace has been built not just on what you've achieved, but on who you've quietly left behind? Why does revenge feel righteous when it's your blood on the floor? You don't think of it as revenge. Not at first. Not when it's still fresh. When your body aches. When your breath is shallow. When your thoughts can't settle because the violation was too sudden. In that moment, all the abstract rules, the morals you thought were solid, feel thin, soft, like a suggestion whispered from a distance. What grows in their place is something colder, simpler. Not a philosophy or a principle, but a certainty that this cannot go unanswered. That the pain you feel must move, must transfer. Not just for justice, but for balance. To make things right again. It doesn't feel like rage. Not exactly. Rage is loud. This is quiet. A low hum beneath your skin, steady and clear. The idea that the person who did this, who took something from you, should feel it too. Should know what it's like to bleed. Should be changed by it. And here's the shift. As that thought hardens, it stops feeling like cruelty. It feels necessary. It feels fair. You tell yourself you're not like them. That your reaction isn't the same as their action. What they did was wrong. What you're considering isn't. It's a response. A correction. Maybe even justice. But justice isn't supposed to feel personal. It isn't supposed to feel good. And yet when you picture it, when you imagine them hurt, afraid, weakened the way you were, you don't flinch. You feel calm, in control. The scales begin to level in your mind. Not legally, not morally, just internally. It's not about making the world better. It's not about preventing future harm. It's about evening something inside you that broke. Because when someone hurts you deeply enough, the idea of fairness becomes physical. You feel it in your body, in your bones. And this is where it turns. Because the closer you get to acting on it, the more you imagine their pain, the less you feel like a victim. The more it feels like you're reclaiming something. Not just power, but dignity. Like their suffering might undo what was done, might erase it. But it won't. You already know that. Even if you don't say it out loud, you know that whatever you do, it won't reverse time. It won't make you untouched. It won't make the violation unreal. Their pain won't heal yours. Still, you want it. That's the part you can't shake. Even knowing it's empty, even knowing it won't fix you, you still want it. Not out of hate. Not exactly, but out of a deep, aching need to feel whole again. And this is where justice becomes something else, something darker. When you stop caring about what's fair and start caring about what feels fair. When the difference between punishment and healing starts to blur. You tell yourself it's right, that it's deserved, that they earned it. You find comfort in that belief, because the alternative is harder to face, that you're no longer acting out of principle. You're just trying to make someone else feel what you feel. And if that's true, if that's really what drives you, then how different are you from them? You'll say it's different. You'll point to the cause, the context, the injury. But deep down, you sense the shift. You feel how easily morality bends when you're in pain. How quickly justice becomes an excuse. How naturally cruelty disguises itself as fairness when it comes from a place of suffering. Because when you're the one bleeding, vengeance feels like balance, like order, like truth. But once you've done it, once they bleed too, what's left? Not closure, not peace, just silence. And in that silence, you're left with the part you couldn't see before, that what you did didn't make you feel better. It just made you feel less alone in the hurt. But not cleaner, not lighter, only more willing to do it again. Have you ever looked at someone who's done something monstrous and tried to imagine what it felt like from the inside? Not to excuse it, not to forgive it, but just to understand how it could ever make sense to them. Because it did. That's the part we don't like to admit. No matter how cruel the action, no matter how devastating the result, at the moment it happened, it felt justified, necessary, even good. Not good in some twisted, evil way. Good in the same way you think your choices are good, rooted in belief, in purpose, in a deep sense of being right. The murderer, the torturer, the tyrant, they almost never see themselves as villains. They don't wake up and think, I want to be evil today. They wake up and think, I must do what's right. And sometimes what's right demands something awful. And that should unsettle you, because it suggests something deeper. That morality is not what protects us from becoming monsters. It's what enables it. Every monstrous act in history was done under a banner of righteousness, for justice, for peace, for protection, for love. Not always those things in truth, but those things in the mind of the person who acted. The moment someone decides they are absolutely right, they stop seeing others as fully human. Opposition becomes evil, doubt becomes weakness, and cruelty becomes necessity. You felt it too, that quiet certainty when you're sure you're on the right side. When the people who disagree seem not just wrong, but dangerous. When anger feels clean, when cruelty feels deserved. When forgiveness seems naive, it doesn't take much. A betrayal, a threat, a sense of being wronged. And suddenly, harming someone feels like restoring balance, like taking back power, like justice. And no one thinks they're the one who went too far. They think they were pushed, provoked. Left with no choice, even the ones you'd never imagine. The war criminal, the terrorist, the abusive parent. If you could sit inside their minds, hear the thoughts that led them to act, you'd find stories of fear, of duty, of revenge, of love, twisted by pain. Not all monsters are born in darkness. Most begin with a wound, a loss, a belief that something precious has been taken, and a promise to never let it happen again. So they build a story, a version of events that makes them the hero, the protector, the avenger. And in that story, anything becomes justified. Even horror. You want to believe there's a line, a point you'd never cross. But what if that line isn't where you think it is? What if it moves when you're hurt, or afraid, or certain? Because certainty is dangerous. It makes you stop asking questions. It makes you see the world in black and white. And in black and white thinking, there's no room for other people to be fully real, only allies or enemies. And once someone becomes your enemy, once they're seen as a threat to what's right, what's good, how easy it becomes to treat them as less than human. That's how it starts. Not with hate, with purpose. The desire to fix something, to punish, to protect, to win. And step by step, cruelty becomes compassion. Violence becomes virtue. And the monster you swore you'd never become is the person you now believe you must be. You don't feel evil. You feel strong, focused, righteous. And even when the consequences are catastrophic, even when you're standing in the wreckage you created, your story protects you. It shields you from doubt, because the alternative is unbearable. The idea that you did harm, thinking you were doing good, that you became what you hated, that your certainty destroyed someone who didn't deserve it. That's why monsters cling to their narratives so tightly, because to let go would mean facing the truth, that they weren't heroes, that they weren't right, that they caused pain they can never undo. And maybe that's the most terrifying part, not that evil exists, but that it can feel so much like goodness when you're the one holding the knife. What if your empathy is just self-defense? What if it has nothing to do with goodness? Imagine this: someone breaks down crying in front of you. Their pain is raw, unfiltered, impossible to ignore. You feel something tighten in your chest, a pull, a reflex. You lean forward, you soften your voice. You tell yourself you're being kind, compassionate. But what if you're not? What if you're reacting, not to their pain, but to your discomfort with it? What if your empathy isn't about them at all? When someone else suffers, it creates tension inside you. Their sadness threatens your calm. Their fear unsettles your sense of safety. Their despair makes you wonder if you're really as okay as you pretend to be. So you rush to soothe them, not for their sake, but to relieve your own unease. Empathy then becomes a shield, a way to manage the emotional chaos that other people bring too close. You comfort them, not because you want to help, but because it helps you feel like the world is still stable, like suffering is manageable, like goodness still exists. And if that's true, then what does it mean about who you are? You might think you're being selfless, generous, emotionally open, but maybe you're just trying to protect your own narrative, the one where you're decent, the one where you care. Maybe, deep down, you're afraid that if you don't respond the right way, you'll be exposed as cold, uncaring, broken. So empathy becomes performance. A script you've rehearsed. You cry at the right moments, speak in soft tones, say all the expected things. And you feel something, yes, but is it compassion or is it fear of what it would mean if you didn't feel anything at all? What would it mean if someone were hurting in front of you and you felt nothing? Would that make you monstrous or just honest? We're told empathy is the core of morality, that it's the reason we help, the reason we care, the reason we don't hurt each other. But what if empathy is just another form of control, a way to keep the emotional world organized, predictable, manageable, safe? Think about how you respond to stories of pain, when the suffering is familiar, when the victim reminds you of someone you love or of yourself. You feel deeply, you ache for them. But when the suffering is foreign, abstract, or too distant, you go numb. You scroll past, you move on. Your empathy has boundaries. It responds to recognition, not justice. Familiarity, not fairness. So is that empathy, or is it a survival mechanism? Because if you allowed yourself to truly feel the full weight of other people's pain, all of it, across the world, every day, you'd collapse. You'd never get out of bed. You'd break apart. So you ration it. You give just enough to feel human, just enough to prove to yourself that you're not indifferent, but you never go too far. Never so far that it becomes unmanageable. You draw invisible lines. You filter who gets your tears and who doesn't. And then you call that morality. But maybe it's not morality. Maybe it's just maintenance. Maybe empathy is how you regulate your emotional ecosystem. A defense system to keep the illusion of goodness intact. You need to feel like a good person. And empathy helps you believe it. Helps you push away the question that haunts you at night. What if I'm not who I think I am? What if I care, not because I'm kind, but because I can't stand the thought of being seen as cruel? What if helping others is just how I avoid facing the emptiness inside me? What if compassion is a mask, and I'm too afraid to take it off? Because then I'd have to face what's really underneath. And maybe it's not empathy at all. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it always was. Would you press it? No consequences, no judgment, no one watching, no one ever finding out. Just a small red button in front of you. Simple, silent, waiting. And if you press it, something bad happens. Not to you, to someone else. Maybe someone you know. Maybe someone you don't. But you benefit. You get something. Money, power, freedom, relief. Whatever you want most, handed to you instantly, without trace. So the question isn't about cost, it's about secrecy, about who you are when no one sees you. And when you realize that, the discomfort begins to settle in. Because the part of you that says, I would never, is loudest when others are listening. It needs an audience, but in the silence, when it's just you and the button, that voice grows quiet, hesitant, uncertain. You begin to notice how easily your mind starts rearranging the boundaries. You tell yourself it's not really that bad, that maybe the person affected deserves it, that the world is full of pain anyway. One more won't matter. You look for loopholes, rationalizations, anything to dull the sharp edge of guilt, and you find them quickly. You don't know who will suffer. It could be someone awful, a criminal, a stranger, someone far away. It's not personal. That makes it easier, less real. But now imagine you do know. Imagine it's someone you've met, someone kind, someone who trusts you. And the offer is still on the table. Same reward, same silence. Would you pause longer, or would you press it just as quickly? Because the reward is still real, and no one will ever know. This is the moment where you begin to confront something uncomfortable. That morality, for many people, is performative. It's shaped by fear of judgment, not internal conviction. You follow the rules because you're seen, because you want to be seen as good, not because goodness exists deep inside you, untouched by visibility. Remove the audience, and something shifts. You stop worrying about right and wrong. You start calculating risks and rewards. You begin to see how thin the wall is between what you say you are and what you might become. And that's where the real fear lives. Not in the button, not in what happens when it's pressed, but in the quiet recognition that a part of you wants to press it. Not impulsively, not carelessly, but coldly, thoughtfully. Because you've done the math, and it works out. That part of you exists. It always has. You've just had enough distance, enough cover, to pretend it didn't. Think about the last time you hurt someone and justified it. The last time you took something that wasn't yours and said it didn't matter. The last time you knew what was right and quietly chose something else. Not because it was easier, but because no one was watching. Now realize those weren't outliers. They were glimpses. Glimpses of the person you are when there's nothing to lose. The red button is just a clearer version of that moment. And what makes it unbearable is how normal it starts to feel. How quickly pressing it becomes routine. You press it once and get what you want. You press it again and again. The guilt fades. The hesitation disappears. The voice inside you that once whispered, "Don't," goes quiet. not silenced by principle, but by repetition. Now imagine the world is full of these buttons, and everyone has one. Everyone convinced they'd never press it. Everyone certain their morality is stronger than temptation. Until they're alone, unseen, in silence. What kind of world would that be? Maybe you already live in it, and maybe the most terrifying realization isn't that people are evil, it's that they're not. They're just ordinary, fragile, flexible. And when given the chance to do harm without consequences, many won't even think twice. Because the red button doesn't change who you are, it reveals it. And if that thought lingers with you, if it stays quietly in the back of your mind, it's not because the button is real, it's because the part of you that would press it is. You see the first face die, and something inside you breaks. Not loudly, not all at once. It's more like a crack you feel, but can't quite locate. The face is real. The eyes are wide. There's fear, pain, confusion. You feel all of it. You carry it with you. It lingers in the space behind your thoughts, even when you try to forget. Then you see another and another, and each time the details blur slightly more. You still recognize the shape of a face, but it no longer holds the same weight. The eyes don't haunt you in the same way. You stop imagining the life behind them. You stop wondering what they were thinking in their final moments. You stop feeling anything. At first, this change disturbs you. You think it's wrong, unnatural. You try to hold on to the pain, as if losing it would make you complicit. But the truth is, the mind adapts faster than you expect. It has to. It knows you can't keep breaking forever, so it dulls the edges, fades the memories, turns the faces into something else. Eventually, they stop looking like people. You still know they are, logically, but the emotional recognition fades. They become shapes, objects, statistics. You see the mouth open, but hear no voice. You see the eyes widen, but feel no connection. It becomes easier to watch, easier to do nothing, easier to look away. You tell yourself you're not like the others, that you still care, that if the circumstances demanded it, you would intervene. But every repetition rewires something deeper. Not out of cruelty, not because you enjoy it, but because it's the only way to survive being near it. And once you've seen enough, you start to forget the first one. The one that made you feel everything. The one that used to wake you up in the middle of the night. You remember it happened, but not how it felt. The intensity that once shook you now feels foreign, distant, unreal. Now imagine this continues. Day after day, year after year, death becomes a pattern, a background detail. You recognize the signs before they happen, but they no longer surprise you, no longer horrify you. You start to expect it, then you start to accept it. The shift is subtle. You don't wake up one morning and feel like a different person, but over time you find yourself reacting less, speaking less, feeling less, not because you've lost your humanity, but because feeling it fully, again and again, would destroy you. And so the face becomes just a face, not a person, not a life, just something that used to mean more. You stop imagining their family, their memories, their future. You stop wondering what they believed in. You stop thinking about whether they were kind or cruel, generous or selfish. None of it matters anymore. The face is only what it was in its final second, still, silent, and gone. You might not even realize it's happened. You still cry at the right moments, still say the right words, but inside there's a growing distance, a blank space where empathy used to be automatic. Now it's a decision, a performance, something you reach for rather than something that rises on its own. And maybe one day, someone asks you about it, about what you've seen, about how it felt, and you try to answer honestly, but your words feel empty, rehearsed. You remember what it should feel like. You remember how others expect you to respond. But the truth is, you don't feel it anymore. Not the way you used to. You're not proud of that, but you're not ashamed either. It just is. A quiet adaptation to something you never wanted to get used to. But here's the part that unsettles you the most. At some point, you realize this numbness doesn't stay contained. It bleeds into everything else. You look at people you love and find it harder to connect, harder to care deeply, harder to see them as vulnerable, as breakable, as human, and that's when you understand what's been lost. Not just your innocence, not just your sensitivity, but your ability to see faces, any face, as sacred, unique, alive. You didn't choose this, you didn't want it, but it happened. Slowly, quietly, with every new face that ceased to matter, until one day you looked at another dying face and felt nothing at all. Have you ever watched someone who's always kind, always agreeable, suddenly become someone you don't recognize? Not a slow shift, not a gradual unraveling, a single moment, sharp, sudden, precise, in everything they've buried, rises all at once. It doesn't make sense at first. They're the ones who never raise their voice, the ones who apologize too much, the ones who say yes even when they mean no. You trust them to be gentle, composed, patient. So when they snap, when they finally break, it feels violent, disproportionate, almost unreal. Maybe what you're seeing isn't a break at all. Maybe it's a release. A system that was always under pressure, always holding back, finally collapsing under the weight it could no longer carry. Because kindness, for some, isn't just a trait, it's a strategy, a defense, a survival mechanism. They smile through disappointment. They stay quiet during conflict. They absorb what others reject, not because they're too weak to resist, but because they've convinced themselves they must. They keep the peace, not because the world is peaceful, but because they believe they're not allowed to disturb it. And that belief doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from years of being punished for anger, years of watching their pain get dismissed, ignored, minimized. Somewhere along the way, they learned it was safer to please than to protest, safer to yield than to fight. So they become agreeable, accommodating, good, but inside, resentment grows, quietly, slowly, consistently. Every time they say it's fine when it isn't. Every time they forgive what they shouldn't. Every time they put someone else's needs above their own and tell themselves it's the right thing to do. They pile disappointment on top of disappointment. They absorb it all, and they become excellent at hiding it. Until one day, something small happens. Something that wouldn't matter to anyone else. A delayed text. A raised eyebrow, a forgotten favor, something trivial. But it breaks the surface tension, and what comes out isn't just about that moment. It's everything they've suppressed, all at once. The words are sharp, the anger is real, and the person on the other side has no idea where it's coming from. They see an overreaction, a meltdown, a personality shift. But what they're really seeing is a reckoning, because people who repress anger don't avoid it. They accumulate it, strategically, inwardly. And when it finally finds a way out, it's not measured, it's not reasonable, it's explosive. Not because they're irrational, but because they've run out of room. And now they aren't protecting others from their emotions anymore. They're finally letting themselves feel the full extent of what they've been carrying. It's not pretty, it's not graceful, but it is honest. The truth is, repression isn't peace. It's just delay, delayed pain, delayed truth, delayed collapse. We tell ourselves that kindness is a virtue, that being nice is always good. But we rarely ask what it costs, what it takes from a person to always be accommodating, what it does to someone to never be allowed to say no without consequence. Eventually, the cost becomes visible, not in words, but in ruptures. You don't notice how deep the water runs until the dam breaks. And by then, it's too late. Because when a cruel person lashes out, you expect it. You prepare for it. You know where it comes from. But when a kind person explodes, it's destabilizing, disorienting. It doesn't match the image you held of them. It forces you to rethink what kindness even is. Maybe it's not always a sign of goodness. Maybe sometimes it's a disguise, a role, a burden. Maybe the person who always listens has never felt heard. Maybe the one who never says no is exhausted by all the times they've wanted to. Maybe the reason they break so hard is because they've spent their whole life trying not to. And now they can't anymore. They don't want to hurt you, but they also don't want to disappear to keep you comfortable. And in that moment, when they finally stop performing, you don't meet the person they've become. You meet the person they've been hiding all along. That's why it feels like a rupture, because it is. Not just a loss of composure, but a loss of the illusion you believed in. You thought they were endlessly patient, but they were just endlessly afraid to disappoint. You thought they never got angry, but they were just too practiced at swallowing it. You thought they were nice, but nice was never the truth. It was just the mask they wore to survive. Would you say something if you knew? If you saw it starting, quietly, invisibly, like a slow fog rolling through a town that didn't notice, it wouldn't look like genocide at first. It would look like small policies, vague warnings, words spoken with just enough ambiguity to be deniable. It would look like economic stress, rising fear, and leaders who talk more about purity than justice. And you'd hear people around you say, "That could never happen here," or "It's not that bad." You'd see them look away, laugh, scroll past. You might do the same, because what's happening doesn't feel urgent yet. It's distant, complicated. There's no single moment that tells you this is where it begins. So you wait. You hope someone else will speak louder than you, someone braver, more informed. You tell yourself it's not your place, not your fight, not your fault, and still, it moves forward. You hear about new laws targeting a specific group. You hear rumors of arrests. Maybe one person disappears, then another. But there's no footage, no headlines, just whispers. You tell yourself you need proof, something undeniable, something official. Until then, it's better not to assume, better not to overreact. But deep down, you already know. And that's where the silence begins. Not in ignorance, but in recognition. The recognition that to speak out would make your life harder, riskier. That taking a stand might mean losing friends, security, comfort. You weigh that silently, and in doing so you become part of the silence that allows it all to continue. Genocide doesn't need monsters. It only needs bystanders. It thrives on people who wait for certainty, who tell themselves it's not the right time, who say, "This isn't my responsibility." You imagine that if it were truly evil, truly obvious, you'd do something. But it never feels that way in the moment. It feels gradual, justified, bureaucratic. It feels like people in power managing a problem. And you tell yourself that maybe they know more than you. Maybe things are more complicated than they seem. You don't want to believe that something terrible is happening, because if you did, you'd have to act. And that would mean disrupting your life, your safety, your identity as someone good, but not radical, aware, but not extreme. So instead, you wait, you explain, you rationalize, and little by little, your silence becomes its own kind of violence. Maybe one day you find out what's really happening. You see the camps, you hear the stories, and you feel horror but not surprise. Because part of you knew, you just didn't speak. And now the question that won't leave you is why? Why did you stay quiet? Why did you let fear decide who you are? Why did you need things to be worse before you believed? But it's too late. And here is the final unbearable truth. Your silence didn't keep you innocent. It only made you invisible. And that's what genocide needs most. Not hatred, not cruelty, just people willing to be invisible, as long as they stay safe. Would you cut someone open to save their life if you knew it would hurt them more than anything else? Not by accident, not as a risk, but as the whole point. Pain, sharp, sustained, unrelenting, becomes the cure, and you're the one who must deliver it. The only way to stop their cancer is to make them suffer, directly, intimately, repeatedly. You imagine it at first like surgery, precise, medical, clinical. You wear gloves, you follow protocol, you measure doses, monitor vitals, apply clean instruments to open wounds. But what if none of that matters? What if pain itself, not the process, is the key? No anesthesia, no sedation, just pain, and your hands. Suddenly, it feels less like surgery and more like something else. You begin to wonder where the line is between healing and harming, between medical necessity and cruelty. The outcome is certain. They live, but only if they suffer, and only if you make them. Would that still make you a surgeon, or does that make you a butcher? You try to assure yourself, you're doing this to help, you're saving lives, but it doesn't feel like saving. Not when you see their eyes, not when you hear them scream, not when the pain you cause is the only thing keeping them alive. You begin to think about morality, about how we usually judge actions by their outcomes. If it works, if they're cured, does that justify everything it took to get there? You want to believe that it does, that results matter, that intent matters, that pain, however awful, becomes acceptable when it saves a life. But what if you start to feel something else? Not revulsion, not pity, but comfort, ease, control. What if causing pain stops feeling difficult? What if it starts to feel natural? You try to convince yourself that it's different, that you're not doing this for pleasure, that it costs you something. But over time, you notice the cost gets smaller, your reactions dull. The first time you shook, the 10th time you just breathed, the 100th time you didn't feel anything at all. What are you now? You don't enjoy it. Not exactly, but you also don't dread it anymore. Pain becomes routine, just part of the process, just a job. And that's what unsettles you most. Not the brutality of it, but the fact that you've adapted, that what once horrified you now feels normal. And maybe that's where the line disappears, because if the only difference between a surgeon and a butcher is the context, if the same action, done with the same hands, can be seen as noble or monstrous, depending on who watches, then what are you, when no one is watching? You start to see how thin that boundary really is. How easily purpose disguises cruelty. How morality can be twisted to justify anything. If the goal is good enough, you tell yourself you're helping people. You point to the lives saved. But what if you've also changed? Quietly, irreversibly. What if part of you now only knows how to harm? And what if that part doesn't go away when the job ends? You try to believe that context matters, that roles define morality. A soldier kills in war and gets medals. A civilian does the same and goes to prison. But then you realize both end a life, both make a choice. Both walk away, changed. And maybe that's the real damage, not what you do, but who you become by doing it. You used to be repulsed by cruelty. Now you study it, you dissect it, you deliver it strategically, even gracefully. You tell yourself it's ethical, necessary. But necessity doesn't soften the screams. It only makes you stop hearing them. And that silence inside you, that growing numbness, that's what scares you most. Because what if you're still doing good, but you've stopped being good? What if your hands heal people, but your heart doesn't feel anything at all? What if, without noticing, you've crossed the line and kept walking? And now you wonder if pain cured cancer. How many would line up to hurt? How many would volunteer to deliver it? How many would do it for the right reasons, then stay for the wrong ones? How many would become butchers, hiding behind a surgeon's mask? And how would you ever know if you were one of them? You feel guilty, but are you sure that's what it is? There's a heaviness in your chest, a tightness in your stomach. Your thoughts loop endlessly, trying to make sense of what happened, trying to find an explanation, a justification, a reason to believe that what you did was necessary, that it wasn't your fault, that you had no choice. But none of those thoughts help. They only deepen the unease. You call it guilt, because guilt sounds like something human, something moral, something that happens when you've done something wrong. But what if it's not that? But what if it's not that? What if it's something older, something simpler? What if your mind doesn't actually care whether what you did was right or wrong? What if it only cares whether you survived? Think about the last time you made a decision that hurt someone else. You explained it, maybe even apologized, but inside, something didn't feel right. It didn't feel resolved. The ache lingered. The doubt persisted. And it wasn't just because of what happened. It was because something in you was trying to reconcile two irreconcilable truths. That you did what you had to do, and that doing it still changed you. This is the trap your brain sets. It's not wired for ethics. It's wired for continuity. It wants the story of your life to make sense, to have reasons, to have coherence. And when something threatens that coherence, when you act in a way that doesn't match who you thought you were, your brain scrambles. It doesn't search for truth. It searches for survival, psychological survival. So it edits. It blurs the memory. It softens the details. It reframes the narrative. And sometimes it calls the pain you feel guilt, when what you're actually feeling is the fracture of your self-image, the loss of the person you believed yourself to be. And here's where it gets darker. Because once your mind discovers that survival can come not just from avoiding harm, but from avoiding guilt, it begins to use guilt as a tool, as camouflage. You can do something cruel, manipulative, selfish, and as long as you feel guilty afterward, you still get to think of yourself as good. The guilt becomes a kind of moral payment, a penance that allows you to keep going, unexamined. It convinces you that you're still decent, because bad people don't feel guilt, but they do. Often, and sometimes the ones who feel guilt most intensely are the ones who've done the worst things, not because they're more moral, but because their survival depends on believing they still are. Your brain doesn't punish you for doing something wrong. It punishes you for threatening your identity. If hurting someone else fits your story, if it's framed as self-defense or necessity or protecting something important, your mind will smooth the edges, it will dull the pain, it will help you sleep. But if what you did doesn't fit, if it exposes something you don't want to see, the guilt won't go away. Not because you've done something worse, but because the survival of your self-concept is now under threat. This is why people can commit atrocities and sleep peacefully, and why others are haunted by small, almost invisible betrayals. It has nothing to do with the act, and everything to do with the story their mind is trying to protect. You think guilt is moral, but it isn't. It's strategic. It's a signal that your inner coherence is cracking. And your brain will do anything to restore that coherence, even if it means lying to you, even if it means convincing you that your pain is proof of your goodness, that your discomfort is the same as responsibility, that feeling bad is the same as being sorry. It's not. Guilt doesn't make you good. It just makes you uncomfortable. And sometimes that discomfort leads to change. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just lingers. A constant hum beneath your thoughts. A dull ache that never leads anywhere. Because survival doesn't require change. It only requires the appearance of it. And this is the final, most disturbing part. Your guilt can become part of your survival. You carry it like a wound, but also like a shield. You use it to protect the version of yourself you don't want to lose. And as long as you feel it, you believe you're still who you were before. But you're not. Something changed. Something broke. And your guilt is not proof that you're still good. It's proof that your mind is trying to protect you from what that change really means. You think you feel guilt, but maybe it's something else entirely. Could you tell the difference between someone who's been hurt and someone who wants to hurt? In most cases, you assume the roles are clear. The victim is innocent, the villain is not. But that distinction begins to blur the moment you look closely. Not just at their actions, but at their histories, their patterns, the cracks in their stories, the quiet, familiar pain in both. You begin to notice something strange. Victims and villains often describe similar origins. Trauma, rejection, isolation. Some were abused, others ignored. Some begged for love and were denied. Others asked for mercy and were broken. And yet, somehow, they went in opposite directions. One collapsed inward, the other lashed outward. You think the difference is character, strength, integrity. You tell yourself that victims who become abusers were never truly victims to begin with, that they were always broken, always dangerous. But that's not true. That's a story you tell to protect yourself from something darker. The possibility that harm can transform. That pain doesn't always seek healing. Sometimes it seeks power. A child who is hurt learns many things. They learn fear, yes, but they also learn attention. They learn that suffering draws focus. That pain can become a weapon, and if no one protects them, if no one shows them how to turn that pain into something safe, something real, they begin to shape it themselves, into control, into cruelty, into the illusion of strength. And so the victim becomes the villain. But not all at once, slowly, step by step, first with thoughts, then with silence, then with small cruelties, justified by memory, by self-pity, by the story of what was done to them. They begin to see their actions not as wrong, but as balanced, fair, necessary. They convince themselves that the world is cruel, and they are simply playing by its rules. Now look closer, not at others, but at yourself. Have you never wanted someone to suffer for what they did to you? Have you never felt pleasure, imagining them feel your pain? That isn't justice. That isn't healing. That's a desire for power over pain. And it's there, inside you. Small, maybe, hidden, but real. You think you're not capable of becoming the villain, but every villain thinks that too. They see themselves as misunderstood, as overreacting, as pushed too far. Their violence always begins with a justification, a reason, a wound. And so the line between victim and villain doesn't lie in the pain itself. It lies in what we do with it. But even that isn't clear, because often they don't feel like they had a choice. What you call choice might be biology, environment, timing. And when you strip away those illusions of control, all that remains is the terrible question: what would you have become in their place? It's easy to condemn from a distance. It's harder when the same darkness lives inside you. You may have suffered deeply. You may still carry that pain. But ask yourself honestly, has your pain ever made you cruel? Have you ever taken something out on someone who didn't deserve it? Have you ever punished the world for not protecting you? The truth is uncomfortable, not just because it exposes others, but because it exposes you. It reveals the thin line you walk every day, the anger you repress, the judgment you feel, the need to be seen, understood, avenged. And maybe what frightens you most isn't what others have done, but how much you understand it. You see the mirror now, and what you thought was a villain's face starts to look familiar. Their rage, their bitterness, even their excuses. Pieces of them live inside you, not in full, not in action, but in potential. You're not evil, but you're not immune. And that's what changes the way you look at people. Not with sympathy, not with forgiveness, but with the quiet, unsettling knowledge that the difference between harm endured and harm inflicted is smaller than you want to believe. The victim and the villain often share a mirror. Sometimes they're the same person, just at different points in the story. Are you more honest when you're being watched, or just better at pretending? It's strange how easily behavior changes under observation. A camera in the corner, a set of eyes behind you, a simple mirror on the wall. That's all it takes. Suddenly, you stand straighter, you speak more carefully, you act more kindly. But is that virtue or performance? You'd like to believe you're consistent, that your actions come from character, not circumstance. But the truth is quieter than that. The truth is that being watched changes you, not sometimes, not a little, but completely. Because when someone's watching, you become who you think they want to see, not who you are, who you need to be to avoid judgment. Even when the observer isn't real, when it's just the idea of being seen, the effect remains. You start editing yourself, scrubbing away flaws, exaggerating strengths. You perform generosity. You stage humility. You simulate empathy. You don't just act differently, you feel different. You feel better, more ethical, more human. But not because you are. Being watched doesn't pull out your best. It suppresses what you fear might be your worst. And that raises a harder question. Are you good, or just good at hiding what isn't? When no one's looking, the mask slips. The urgency fades. You move with less care, speak with less thought. The parts of you that can harm or lie or cheat, those aren't new. They were always there. They were just silenced when you felt observed, which means the person you are, in private, is not your truest self, either. It's just another version, unfiltered, but incomplete. You begin to see the problem. You're not a single person, steady across all contexts. You're different depending on who you think is watching or not watching. The real you isn't hidden in one of those versions. The real you is the contradiction between them. And that contradiction is never stable. It bends, it fractures, it slips between extremes. Under scrutiny, you might resist your worst impulses, but you might also grow resentful. Contained, you might become dishonest in subtler ways, ways that preserve your image but rot your integrity. Because performance isn't always visible. Sometimes it's internal. A soft lie you tell yourself to stay comfortable. A way of becoming not better, but harder to read. Observation makes some people cautious, others desperate. Some rise under pressure, others collapse. There is no consistent moral upgrade. There's only distortion. If someone praises your behavior under surveillance, is it really praise for you, or praise for your fear? And if someone exposes what you do in secret, is that the truth, or just another mask worn in the dark? Neither is whole. You want there to be a true version of yourself, something stable beneath the layers. But you're starting to understand that true might not exist in isolation. There is no final, authentic version, only the shifting pattern of how you react to visibility. So maybe being watched doesn't make you better or worse. It makes you different. But that difference is directional. It polarizes. It pulls you toward extremes. When someone sees you, you become a version optimized for them. When no one does, you become a version optimized for freedom. Neither is more real. Both are distortions. And the worst part is, you never get to escape them. You're always being shaped by the level of attention around you, whether you notice it or not. Sometimes, being watched improves your actions, but poisons your motives. Other times, it reveals honesty, but celebrates cruelty. You can't rely on the gaze to make you good. You can only rely on it to make you visible. And visibility isn't virtue, it's pressure. So the next time you act out of goodness, ask yourself quietly, would I still do this if no one ever knew? And then ask something harder, if no one ever knew, would I do something else entirely? Because in the end, the only thing worse than being shaped by the gaze of others is realizing you've never once been free from it. What if the cheering is the moment your conscience disappears? You're in a crowd, not a faceless one, not one so large you feel anonymous. This is smaller, intimate, a group you know, you trust them, you feel like they see you. And then something happens, someone stumbles, someone is mocked, a rule is broken, a line is crossed, and someone laughs. Then another. Then the group begins to cheer. It's not loud at first, just a sound of approval, layered with delight. It feels good to be on the inside of that sound, to be part of it. Maybe you smile, maybe you clap, not because you believe in what's happening, but because everyone else does. And suddenly, you're not watching something wrong, you're participating in something right. Morality doesn't vanish in that moment, it just fades into the background. Your discomfort becomes less important than your belonging. You don't notice the shift, not consciously. You just feel less alone, more certain. It's easier to follow the energy than to resist it. You don't even think of it as a decision, but look closer. If this moment were happening in silence, just you and the person being hurt, would you still feel the same? Would you still smirk? Would you still stand there, relaxed? Or would your stomach twist? That twisting, the quiet recoil, that's morality. And it only speaks when the noise dies down. But now imagine the noise never stops. Imagine a situation where every cruel act is met with applause. Every violation is turned into entertainment. Everyone around you celebrates, and so you do too. Not loudly, not violently, but you go along, you nod, you say nothing, you stay. You don't think of yourself as cruel, you just feel part of something. The cheering tells you it's okay. More than okay, it's good, right, justified, necessary. You don't question it, because to question it would mean separating yourself from the group, and separation feels worse than guilt. Now ask yourself, how many times have you seen this happen? Not just in others, in yourself. The moment you laughed because everyone else did. The moment you stayed quiet because speaking would have made you a target. The moment someone else paid the price for your acceptance. You tell yourself you're not like that you'd speak up, that you'd do the right thing. But that's not true, is it? The truth is, most of the time, you don't even notice when your morality switches off. You're too busy absorbing the mood of the room, you adjust automatically. You blend, you follow, and you think that's harmless. You think it's just social instinct. But what if that instinct is exactly what makes evil possible? Not through hatred, not through ideology, but through momentum, through the simple desire to not be left out. You imagine evil as something loud, violent, separate from you. But often, it's quiet, ordinary, and wrapped in the warmth of approval. It's not committed in rage, it's committed in unison. And the most disturbing part, you might never notice when you cross the line, because the group will make sure you feel good about it. They'll smile at you, they'll tell you you're right, they'll cheer. And once they do, morality stops being a voice inside you. It becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever the group wants to see. You'll think you're being good, but you'll only be obedient. And obedience feels like safety, even when it leads to harm, even when it turns you into something you never meant to become. And that's the quiet horror. Your morality isn't fixed, it's reactive, fragile, willing to disappear the moment it feels outnumbered. And sometimes all it takes is the sound of a group clapping. Imagine you're sitting in a room, a quiet room. The lights are dim, the air still on the screen in front of you. Something horrible is happening. A man is being humiliated, laughed at, hurt. It isn't fictional, he's real. You know it. You can see the shame in his face, the way he tries to hide it. And you don't look away. You tell yourself it's just a clip, just a video. You didn't make it. You're not the one hurting him. You're just watching, like everyone else. But that's the first lie, because you're not just watching. You're choosing not to stop it, not to click away, not to speak up, not to care enough to act. And deep down you know you could. You know that in some small way, every second you stay is a kind of permission, a signal that says, go on, keep going, I'll stay. You'd rather be the silent observer than the one who ruins the moment for everyone else. You'd rather keep watching cruelty than be the one who interrupts it. That's what makes this so uncomfortable. You're not the monster in the room. You're something more ordinary, more common. You're the one who doesn't stop it, even when you know you could. And here's what's worse. Part of you enjoys it. Not the violence itself, maybe, but the feeling, the sensation of witnessing something raw, something stripped of politeness. You feel the tension of the forbidden, the pull of power and fear mixing together. You feel alive, present, awake. For a moment, everything else fades. You're just there, absorbed. It's not sadism. It's something subtler. You don't want to hurt anyone, but you're willing to let someone be hurt, as long as it's not you, as long as you get to stay in the room. And if someone else had stepped in, if someone had stopped it, you would have nodded, agreed, said you were uncomfortable the whole time. You would have been relieved, grateful, but you wouldn't have been the one to do it. Because stepping in means standing out. It means breaking the illusion that you're invisible, that you're just passing through. It means admitting you have a line and showing where that line is. And that's dangerous. Because what if they turn on you? What if you become the target? So you wait. You stay quiet. You pretend you didn't see it clearly. You act like you weren't sure what was happening. You hide behind uncertainty, even though you saw everything. You understood everything. You were just hoping someone else would speak first. And the more you do this, the easier it gets. The less it bothers you, the less you feel. Until one day, you find yourself watching something far worse. And you don't even flinch. You've built up a tolerance. Not to violence, but to your own discomfort. To your own capacity to ignore it. And that's when you start telling yourself another lie. You say there was nothing you could have done, that it would have happened anyway, that stopping it was never your responsibility. But that's not true either, because you weren't powerless. You were silent. And silence, when cruelty is happening, is not neutrality. It's agreement. It's approval. It's permission. You've never hurt anyone, you say. But you've also never stopped anyone. You've never thrown the punch, but you've made space for it to land. And when you look at the worst moments in history, that's who you see. Not just the perpetrators, but the bystanders, the silent crowds, the ones who watched from windows, who turned away, who said, "It's not my place," who said, "What could I have done?" That's the part no one wants to admit. Evil doesn't need a lot of believers. It just needs enough people who would rather watch than act. Enough people who are more afraid of conflict than of cruelty. And when you think about that, really think about it, you realize something else. It's not the person committing the harm that terrifies you most. It's how close you are to them, how easily you could become them, how similar your silence is to their action, and how small the difference between the two becomes when no one says anything at all. Because in the end, the choice was never about whether cruelty would happen. It was about whether you would be part of it, and you already were. What happens when every attempt to stop evil creates a new kind of loophole? Every law, every code of conduct, every rule written to guide behavior. At first it feels like progress. It feels like control. But slowly, almost invisibly, each rule becomes a map, a boundary not just to follow, but to work around. A limitation that implies its own invitation. If a rule tells you what not to do, then it also tells you what you might get away with. And that possibility never disappears. In the beginning, rules exist to protect. They provide clarity, structure, expectations. But over time, they also reveal something else, where the edge is. And once you know where the edge is, the temptation becomes about how close you can get, or how cleverly you can cross it without being seen. The rule itself starts to lose meaning. It becomes less about morality and more about performance. Obedience isn't the goal anymore. Appearance is. You follow the rule just enough to be safe, just enough to avoid punishment, just enough to keep your hands clean. But underneath, the intention has already shifted. You're no longer asking what's right. You're asking what you can get away with. That's the quiet, dangerous evolution of human behavior. We don't break rules blindly. We study them. We test them. We twist them. And slowly, we convince ourselves that so long as we stay technically compliant, we're still good, still innocent, still moral. But are we? Imagine a person who lies constantly, but always just inside the bounds of plausible deniability. They never admit the lie. They never get caught. Technically, they haven't broken a rule. But what have they become? How different are they really from someone who lies openly? What happens when the difference between guilt and innocence is no longer about the act itself, but about whether it can be proven? Now imagine that person isn't just an individual. Imagine it's a system, an institution, a society. Rule after rule, layered on top of each other, not to guide morality, but to shape perception. A legal structure that rewards manipulation, a corporate policy that incentivizes cruelty, a political framework that confuses power with justice. You can follow every rule and still create harm. You can remain completely within the boundaries and still build something deeply wrong. The rules didn't prevent evil. They disguised it. They offered a shield, and in some cases, they even made it easier. This isn't a theoretical concern. It's already happening. In workplaces, in governments, in homes, people who cause harm, while citing the rules that allow them to. People who build their identities around compliance, while quietly violating the spirit behind every guideline they claim to follow. And we admire them. We call them smart, strategic, disciplined. We reward cleverness over kindness, success over decency. We start to believe that if something isn't illegal, it must be acceptable. If it doesn't break the rules, it doesn't break the person. But rules were never meant to be the ceiling of morality. They were supposed to be the floor, the minimum. a starting point for understanding right from wrong, not the whole map. And when we treat them like the end of the conversation, we create something fragile, something hollow, something that looks like order but feels like rot. That's how evil hides. Not in chaos, but in bureaucracy, in loopholes, in procedures followed exactly as written, in policies designed to be technically fair but emotionally dead. The more rules we create, the more ways we invent to manipulate them. And the more comfortable we feel doing so, because we've learned how to hurt people without ever breaking a law. And if you're honest, you've probably done it too. Not in dramatic ways, but in small, quiet decisions. Words chosen carefully to avoid accountability. Promises phrased just vaguely enough to be broken later. Decisions that benefit you, dressed in the language of responsibility. Every one of them within the rules. Every one of them invisible from the outside, but not from the inside. Because even if no one else sees the cracks, you do. You know when you're obeying the letter of the rule, but violating everything it was meant to protect. You feel that gap, that unease, that quiet knowledge that your goodness is conditional, that your morality depends on how well you can navigate the system. And maybe that's the most disturbing realization, that evil doesn't always break the rules. Sometimes it writes them, sometimes it hides behind them, and sometimes it becomes you, not when you do something wrong, but when you stop asking whether it's right. Because the more rules we write, the more comfortable we become, replacing our conscience with compliance. And the more we do that, the easier it becomes to believe that morality is nothing more than following instructions. Until one day you realize the rules didn't make you good, they just made it easier to pretend. You're walking down a hallway, late at night. The lights are soft, the air still, and then someone smiles at you. Not a stranger, not exactly. Maybe a coworker, a neighbor, someone you've spoken to before, briefly, politely. They smile in that slow, easy way that suggests warmth, familiarity, harmlessness, and in that instant, something shifts. Because it's only after they smile that you notice what's missing. There's no tension in the eyes, no emotional echo behind the gesture. It's like watching a mask stretch into place, too smooth, too slow. The smile means nothing. And now you feel the cold certainty that something is deeply wrong. This is the moment most people miss. They imagine danger as something loud, sudden, obvious. But the most dangerous people blend in. They mimic, they watch, they rehearse. You think you'd recognize them by their violence or anger, but you wouldn't, not until it's too late. Psychopaths don't show up with flashing signs. They appear calm, charming, even. Their voice steady, their gaze unflinching. They make you feel seen, understood, safe. It's deliberate, because a psychopath doesn't care what you feel, only how to make you feel it. You think you're a good judge of character. Most people do. You trust gut instinct, emotional cues, the small details that signal sincerity. But what if those are the very tools being used against you? What if the smile you trust is designed for that exact purpose, to soften you, disarm you, make you vulnerable? By the time you notice something's off, they've already calculated the next step. They're already adjusting, shaping themselves to fit whatever you want them to be. And the more open you are, the more you reveal your fears, your habits, your boundaries, the easier it is for them to step around those boundaries without resistance. It doesn't start with violence. It starts with charm, with attention, with empathy that feels genuine. But it isn't empathy. It's strategy. Every gesture is measured. Every response tuned to mirror what you need. Not out of care, but control. And the more convinced you are that they're safe, the less prepared you'll be when they aren't. This isn't about villains in stories. It's about people in offices, schools, relationships. People who learn to imitate normalcy so precisely that their absence of feeling becomes invisible. And when they finally do harm, those around them are always shocked. Because they smiled, they were polite. They seemed so normal, but that's the trap. The smile isn't proof of goodness, it's camouflage. And once you understand that, you start to see how easily deception can hide inside politeness. How easily manipulation can wear the face of charm. How fragile your assumptions really are. You think you'd feel afraid in the presence of someone dangerous. But fear isn't what they evoke. Not at first, they make you feel calm, safe, in control. And that's the most disorienting part. They study what makes people trust, and then they perform it back like a script. And because it looks right, you believe it is right. It's only later that you see the pattern, the inconsistencies, the lies, the moments that didn't quite add up. But by then, you've already let them in. You've already lowered your guard. And maybe, like many others, you tell yourself it's just your imagination, that you're being paranoid, because nothing about them seems dangerous. Not really, until they smile. And in that instant, your instincts scream, not because of what the smile shows, but because of what it lacks. There's no warmth behind it, no empathy, no hesitation, just the cold awareness of someone who sees you as useful, temporary, replaceable. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You start to question every interaction, every kind word, every familiar face. You wonder how often you've been fooled. How many people have worn the same smile? How close you've come without ever realizing it. The fear isn't that they exist. The fear is that they pass as normal, that you walk past them every day, speak to them, laugh with them, and you never know what they are. Not until they smile at you, and then it's already too late. What if your kindness is just manipulation with better PR? Imagine you do something generous. You help a stranger, donate money, comfort someone in pain. They thank you, maybe even admire you. And for a moment, you feel good, useful, important, kind. But then a quiet question arises. Did you do it for them or for yourself? What if the warmth you feel after helping someone isn't empathy at all? It's relief. Relief that you look like a good person. Relief that others see you that way. That you see yourself that way. What if kindness is just another kind of transaction? One where the reward isn't material, but reputational, psychological, internal. You don't think of it that way. Of course, you call it compassion, generosity, integrity. But how often do you help when no one knows? How often do you act purely for others, when there's no credit, no gratitude, no story to tell yourself afterward? And even when you do help quietly, privately, are you sure it's selfless? Or is it just another way to maintain the image you need to believe in? One where you're the kind of person who helps quietly, privately. Maybe the approval you're seeking isn't from others. Maybe it's from yourself. Now look back. Think of all the times you've helped someone, comforted them, gone out of your way to do something good. Did you do it because they needed you, or because you needed to feel? Needed because that need, it's powerful, and it disguises itself well. You say you hate manipulation. You say it's dishonest, unethical. But what if the most dangerous manipulation isn't something done to others? It's what you do to yourself. What if your morality, your goodness, your kindness is just your way of getting what you want without admitting it? Maybe it's not love, it's the need to feel lovable. Not generosity, but a strategy to avoid guilt. Not care, but control, dressed up as concern. Because if someone relies on you, if they see you as good, then you're safe, you're necessary, you matter. But now ask When you help someone and they don't respond the way you hoped, if they don't thank you, don't acknowledge your effort, or worse, reject your help entirely, how do you feel? Angry? Hurt? Betrayed? Doesn't that tell you something? Doesn't it reveal that your kindness had expectations attached? Silent ones, hidden ones, but expectations all the same. You tell yourself you don't expect anything in return, but if you're honest, isn't the return already built in? Isn't the act itself designed to protect your identity, to reinforce your role as the good one, the helper, the better person? And when someone challenges that, when they don't respond with gratitude, when they see through the performance, doesn't it feel like an attack? Like something personal has been exposed? Because deep down, maybe that's exactly what's happening. Maybe the worst kind of manipulation isn't external, it's internal. It's how you keep yourself from facing the parts of you that are selfish, strategic, insecure. You hide them beneath gestures of goodwill, but they're still there, driving everything. It doesn't mean your kindness isn't real, but maybe real isn't the same as pure. Maybe it's always mixed. Need and care, guilt and love, pride and generosity, all tangled together in ways you don't want to see. And now think about the people who call themselves nice. The ones who insist they're kind, loyal, caring. How often is that insistence a warning, a sign that their identity is fragile, constructed, defensive? How often does that mask slip, just a little, when they don't get what they want? You've seen it. Maybe you've done it. That moment when kindness turns cold, controlling, punitive. When disappointment turns into quiet punishment. When someone you helped becomes someone you resent. Because they didn't give you what you never admitted you wanted. You start to realize manipulation isn't always loud or cruel. Sometimes it's soft. Gentle, kind, it looks like care, but it's control. It sounds like compassion, but it's really a form of self-preservation. A performance. One that's convincing because it has to be. And you start to wonder how many of your good deeds were actually negotiations. Not with the people you helped, but with yourself. With the part of you that needs to believe you're a good person. The part that can't tolerate the idea that your motives might be more selfish, more strategic, more hollow than you'd like to admit. But here's the worst part. Even now, knowing all this, you'll keep helping people. You'll still be kind, still donate, comfort, give. And you'll wonder every time whether you're doing it for them or for you. And maybe you'll never know. Maybe the answer doesn't exist. Or maybe it does, and you're just not ready to hear it. Why do they never hesitate? Not the ones giving the orders, but the ones following them. The ones who carry them out, step by step, face to face. They don't scream. They don't break down. They don't run away. They move calmly, precisely, sometimes even with a quiet sense of purpose. And they never think they're evil. Ask them afterward, and they'll tell you they had no choice. They'll say the system was bigger than them, that the responsibility belonged to someone higher up, that it was necessary, that it was protocol, that they were just doing their job. But ask more deeply, and something stranger emerges. Not just detachment, not just obedience, a kind of comfort. A belief that what they did made sense, that it was right, given the circumstances. They speak not with pride, but with confidence. They don't sound like monsters. They sound like people who still believe they were good, and that's what makes it so difficult to face. We imagine evil as loud, chaotic, obvious, but it isn't. It's organized, quiet, systematic. It hides inside rules, routines, uniforms, and rituals. It moves not with rage, but with order. It doesn't feel like cruelty. It feels like procedure. When you follow orders, you don't need to think about what's right. Someone already did that for you. The weight of the decision isn't yours anymore. You're just the hands, just the mouth, just the one who carries the paper, flips the switch, signs the form. You never touch the consequence directly, and when you do, you tell yourself it's not really yours. You tell yourself you're just part of the machine, that it would keep moving without you, that refusing wouldn't change anything, that guilt belongs to someone else. So you follow the instructions, you silence the doubt, you keep your head down, and over time, the thing you feared stops feeling wrong. It becomes normal, familiar, just another part of the day. You stop asking why, and this is the part we forget. Most people who carry out harm aren't convinced of their own evil. They're convinced of their own duty, their own loyalty, their own necessity. They believe they're keeping things running, keeping order, doing what must be done. And the more routine the harm becomes, the more invisible it feels. But here's the unsettling part. This isn't just history. It isn't just soldiers or guards or bureaucrats. It's us. It's the way we defer responsibility every day, the way we accept systems that benefit us without asking who they harm, the way we ignore suffering. We didn't directly cause. We follow instructions, social rules, unspoken norms. We avoid questions that make things harder. We participate in harm indirectly, then tell ourselves we didn't choose it, that we're not responsible, that we're good. But following orders doesn't erase your part in what happens. It just makes it easier to deny. Because when the outcome is distant, abstract or slow, it's easier to stay quiet, easier to keep moving, easier to tell yourself there's no other option. And over time, the discomfort fades. The habit settles in, and you forget that there was ever a moment when it felt wrong. You begin to see yourself, not as someone who made a choice, but as someone who had none. And maybe that's the scariest part. The realization that the greatest evils are not carried out by people who feel hatred, but by people who feel nothing. People who learn to stop questioning. People who were just trying to stay in line, keep their place, do their job. People who still believe, after everything, that they did nothing wrong. And once that belief sets in, once you've decided you were never the one making the choice, it's almost impossible to undo. Because you don't just deny the harm, you deny your ability to have ever chosen differently. And if you believe that, truly believe it, then you were never the one in control at all. You were just part of the machine, not resisting it, not stopping it, just keeping it running, thoughtlessly, without guilt. And maybe that's what makes it all possible. Not hatred, not cruelty, just obedience. You don't wake up one morning and decide to become a monster. That's not how it begins. It starts with a small task, something that doesn't feel wrong, a form to fill out, a list to complete, a signature on a page. You're told it's necessary. You're told it's part of your job. You don't question it because there's nothing to question yet. The people giving the instructions seem calm, rational. They have titles, uniforms, procedures. Everything is documented, structured, sanitized. You're not asked to make decisions, just to follow through. And so you do. You sort the names, you enter the data, you check the boxes. Each action feels clean, technical, precise. You're told it's for efficiency, for order, for safety. You never see what happens next. That part is someone else's job. And because it's divided like this, because each person only sees their part, no one feels responsible. You convince yourself that your hands are clean because they never directly touched anything bloody. But blood doesn't care about proximity. You look around and everyone else is doing the same thing. signing the same forms, following the same rules. It feels normal. It feels safe. When everyone participates, it doesn't feel like evil. It feels like protocol. Eventually, the checklists grow longer. The language changes subtly. Relocation replaces removal. Processing replaces execution. Words are selected carefully to distance the action from its consequences. The uglier the truth becomes, the cleaner the language sounds. You're told that asking questions would disrupt the process. That uncertainty creates danger. That obedience protects everyone. So you suppress your discomfort. You tell yourself there must be a good reason, that someone else has thought it through. Then one day, the checklist includes something that feels different, not worse, just more obvious. A requirement to verify someone's ethnicity, or to record their beliefs. You pause for a moment. Then you remind yourself it's not up to you, that the system knows what it's doing. You don't want to feel responsible, so you don't think about it too long. At some point, a voice inside you says, "This doesn't feel right," but it's quiet, easy to ignore. And when you glance around, you see no one else hesitating. So you swallow that voice. You keep going. It's just one more box to check. And in that moment, something small inside you shifts. It's not dramatic, not a collapse, just a quiet adjustment, a narrowing of attention, a willingness to look away, a soft agreement with silence. From that point on, you stop noticing the discomfort. It becomes background noise. You begin to feel pride in how efficiently you perform your task. You're recognized for your reliability, your speed, your discipline. The checklist becomes a measure of your worth. You stop thinking about what it's connected to. And if you ever hear whispers about what happens on the other side, what happens to the people whose names you process, you tell yourself it's exaggerated. You insist you're not involved. You remind yourself you're just following orders because the alternative is unbearable. If you allowed yourself to truly see what your actions contribute to, you'd have to stop. You'd have to leave. You'd have to risk everything. And most people won't. So instead, you distance yourself further. You focus only on the task. You stop seeing people. You see cases, categories, numbers. You measure success by how many boxes you complete, how quickly the list disappears. And slowly, the people on the list disappear too. Not just from the world, but from your awareness. Their names become meaningless. Their fates become invisible. And you remain behind your desk, still telling yourself it's just a job. Still pretending that compliance isn't participation. But it is. Evil doesn't always come in the form of rage or violence. It often arrives through routines, through procedures, through quiet obedience dressed up as professionalism. It arrives one checkbox at a time. And by the time you realize what you've been part of, it's too late. The system is already moving without you. The machine you helped maintain is still running. You were only one piece, but you were a necessary one. And now you see clearly. You didn't just follow the checklist, you helped write it. Would you raise a baby in a lie to protect its soul? Imagine a child born into a world you know is cruel. A world that twists innocence into confusion, that rewards selfishness, punishes honesty, and leaves kindness exposed. You've seen what this place does to people. You've seen the slow erosion of belief, of goodness, of trust, and now, somehow, you've been given the chance to raise one child outside all of that. What if you could build a life for them completely sheltered from the truth? What if every book, every conversation, every lesson was carefully constructed to convince them that the world is fair, that people are kind, that love is permanent and pure? What if you could raise a child who never learns what betrayal feels like, who never sees manipulation or hate or cruelty, It would be a lie, a complete fabrication, but it would be beautiful. At first, it feels like compassion. You imagine the child smiling, trusting, loving freely without fear. They would grow up believing in goodness, not because they fought for it, but because they never learned to doubt it. They would see the world as sacred. Every moment would feel safe. And you'd know it wasn't true. You'd wake up every morning with the weight of it. You'd nod along when they tell you how kind people are, how just the world seems. You'd feel their joy. And with it, a kind of dread. Because they're not prepared. They're not protected. They're blind. But is that blindness innocence, or is it a kind of mercy? The question begins to shift. It's no longer just about protecting them. It's about what kind of person you want them to become. Because once they know the truth, even a little of it, they'll never see the world the same way again. That belief in goodness, once broken, never really returns. So you think, maybe it's better if they never learn. Maybe a beautiful lie is worth more than a painful truth. But then, something else starts to creep in. You wonder what kind of person this child will grow into. Will they trust too easily? Will they believe too much in people who don't deserve it? Will they be taken advantage of, used, broken, because they never learned to be cautious? And if that happens, will it be your fault? You told yourself you were protecting their soul. But what if you were just delaying the damage, letting it happen later, when they're older, more vulnerable, more alone? Or worse, what if the damage doesn't come from outside at all? What if it's you? You taught them to believe in a world that doesn't exist. You shaped their view of everything. What happens when they find out? When they realize every comforting truth they held was placed there by your hands? Do they stop trusting the world, or do they stop trusting you? You might think they'll never find out. That you've built the illusion so carefully, so completely, that they'll carry it to their grave. But lies, no matter how gentle, always leave traces. A question unanswered, a story that doesn't add up, a moment of fear in your eyes when they ask the wrong thing. And once the doubt begins, it spreads. Maybe they start to question everything, not just the world, but themselves. They wonder why they were the only one who didn't know. They wonder what it says about them, that someone thought they couldn't handle the truth. They wonder if their goodness was real or just manufactured. And now the soul you were trying to protect starts to fracture, not from cruelty, but from betrayal. You told yourself it was love. You told yourself you were shielding them from pain. But maybe it was just fear. Fear of seeing them become like the world. Fear of watching their innocence die. Fear of facing the truth that no matter how much you love them, you can't stop reality from reaching them. Because eventually, it always does. And what if it doesn't? What if you succeed completely? What if they live their entire life inside the lie? Would that be a victory? They'd be kind, generous, hopeful. They'd believe in a world that doesn't exist. They'd feel safe in a place that isn't safe. And they'd die, never knowing they were deceived. Is that purity? Or is it delusion? You'd know, every day. You'd watch them. Thank you for protecting them, for guiding them, for giving them a life filled with light. And you'd nod, smile, pretend it was all real, knowing it wasn't. You'd live with the quiet knowledge that their soul was shaped not by truth, but by manipulation, that their faith was real, but built on something false. You protected them, but to do it, you had to lie, constantly, completely. And now you have to wonder, was the soul you were protecting ever really theirs? Or was it something you created, something you owned, something you controlled? Maybe that's the real cost, not just the lie, but the fact that you never gave them the choice. You never let them see the world and decide for themselves who to become. You gave them peace. But you took away everything else, and now you're left with a question you can't answer. Was it love, or was it fear, wearing love's face? What if love isn't what you think it is? What if it isn't profound or sacred or meaningful? What if it's just a trick, one designed by evolution to keep you tethered to something that no longer serves you? You feel it as connection. You explain it as trust, affection, longing. You believe it's about another person. But love doesn't begin with reason. It doesn't even begin with understanding. It begins with chemicals, neurotransmitters, hormones, circuits firing in patterns you didn't choose. When you fall in love, your brain floods with dopamine. Serotonin drops, mimicking the effects of obsession. Oxytocin and vasopressin push you toward bonding, closeness, loyalty. These reactions evolved not to make you happy, but to make you stay, to make you need someone, to make you build something larger than yourself. In early human tribes, survival meant cooperation. Those who bonded deeply, who stayed with their group, lived longer. The ones who wandered off died. Their genes didn't continue. So nature selected for attachment, dependency, emotional fusion, not because it was noble, but because it worked. And this is the part you don't want to hear. The love you feel might not be about the other person at all. It might be about keeping you from running, from drifting too far, from becoming inconveniently free. You say you love someone, but what if you're only experiencing an evolutionary reflex? What if the intensity of that emotion isn't proof of meaning, but evidence of manipulation? A beautiful lie designed to prevent you from abandoning your tribe, your role, your obligations. Think about jealousy, the fear of betrayal, the panic when someone pulls away. These aren't romantic, they're territorial, primitive mechanisms to preserve pair bonds, to protect shared resources. Even the pain of heartbreak serves a purpose. It punishes separation. It conditions you, like a shock collar, to avoid future detachment. Now consider this. If love is a chemical system meant to control your behavior, then maybe it isn't about who you are, but who you're supposed to be. A loyal partner, a contributing member, a predictable unit in a larger structure. Love doesn't care about your truth. It cares about your compliance. But still, you insist love feels real. You say it changes you, that it's more than biology, that it's spiritual. And maybe it is. But maybe that's also part of the trick. A successful illusion doesn't feel like a trick. It feels like truth. That's how it works. If love felt hollow or mechanical, it wouldn't serve its purpose. The only way to keep you from leaving the tribe is to make you believe that staying is sacred. And maybe it works too well. Maybe you stay in situations that hurt you, hoping the feeling will return. Maybe you sacrifice your freedom for stability, mistaking dependency for devotion. Maybe the idea of love keeps you afraid of solitude, afraid of questioning what you've built, afraid of stepping away. You might think you're staying because you care, but maybe you're staying because your brain won't let you leave. Because to your biology, leaving is death. And what if this applies not just to romantic love, but to every bond you hold dear? Your friendships, your family, your community. What if every form of closeness is laced with invisible chains, not out of cruelty, but design? The truth is hard to face, that your deepest emotions might not reflect who you are, but what you were shaped to be. That even your love, your most private, cherished feeling, isn't fully yours. And if you knew that, really knew it, what would you do with that knowledge? Would you pull away? Would you test the strength of your bonds, or would you keep pretending, because pretending feels safer? Maybe that's the final trick, that even when you see it clearly, Even when the illusion starts to crack, part of you still wants to believe, still wants to stay, because deep down, some part of you remembers the cost of leaving the tribe, the silence, the exile, the slow creeping death of being truly alone, and so you stay. Not because it's right, not because it's true, but because love won't let you leave. The darker the secret, the warmer the smile. You've met someone like this. You can't quite explain why, but there's something about them that feels too smooth, too composed. They laugh easily, nod thoughtfully, hold eye contact just long enough to seem sincere. They make you feel seen, even special. But somewhere beneath that warmth, something feels slightly off. And you don't know why. Maybe you dismiss it. Tell yourself you're being paranoid, that kindness doesn't always hide an agenda. But the feeling stays with you, because their smile is too polished, their interest too perfectly timed, like they've practiced it, like they've learned how to be exactly who you need them to be. And the darker thought follows. What if they have? Not out of malice, not out of manipulation, but out of necessity. What if the warmth is a kind of camouflage, a mask so carefully constructed, it's almost indistinguishable from real feeling, because something inside them must never be seen, something that, if exposed, would change everything. It's easy to imagine secrets as loud, dramatic things, crimes, betrayals, hidden lives. But sometimes the most dangerous secrets are quiet, simple facts about who someone really is, what they've done, what they feel or don't feel. And once a person learns to carry something that cannot be spoken, they also learn to hide it beneath whatever makes others feel safe. That's what the smile is for. It's not deceit in the usual sense. It's not about tricking you. It's about control, because if you saw what they really carried, if you felt even a glimpse of the weight behind their charm, you might pull away, you might leave. And they can't allow that. So the smile stays, bright, measured, undisturbable. A smile that doesn't just protect them, it protects you from knowing too much, from asking the wrong question, from realizing just how close you are to something you don't understand. And maybe you think you'd notice, that you'd sense the contradiction, but that's what makes it unsettling. You don't. Because people like this aren't hiding rage or sadness. They're hiding something colder, something still. They've practiced it for years, studied your reactions, learned what works. Their warmth is a strategy. Their kindness is a weapon, not to harm, but to preserve their own safety, their own secrecy. You wonder how many people you've trusted like this, how many conversations felt intimate, but were carefully managed, how many relationships were built on warmth that wasn't real, how many smiles were covering something darker. And then you realize something else. Sometimes it's not them you're thinking about. Sometimes it's you. You know what it feels like to carry something you can't say out loud, a thought you shouldn't have had, a thing you once did, a feeling that would change how others see you. And you remember how easy it was to smile through it, to say the right thing, to act unfazed. You remember how natural it felt to nod, to reassure, to laugh when you were supposed to. And slowly, you realize that hiding isn't always a choice. Sometimes it becomes a reflex. You don't even notice when it starts. The smile just appears. Automatic, reliable, a way to survive the weight of being known too fully. And once you learn it works, you never unlearn it. That's the part no one talks about. That deception, when it becomes habit, doesn't feel dishonest. It feels necessary, and it begins to shape who you are, not just in front of others, but inside your own mind. You start editing your thoughts before you even think them, filtering your reactions, smiling, not just to hide, but because you've forgotten what it means not to. And that's the real secret. It's not just that some people are hiding something behind their smile. It's that, over time, the smile becomes who they are. The performance becomes permanent. And the person they were before it, the one who could have confessed, who could have faltered, is gone. So the next time someone smiles at you warmly, holds your gaze, makes you feel at ease, pause for just a moment, not to doubt them, but to wonder how many times they've had to do this before, how much effort it takes to seem effortless, how many parts of themselves they've buried just to keep that smile intact. And ask yourself quietly, if you were hiding something you couldn't ever reveal, wouldn't you smile like that too? What happens inside you the moment someone says, obey? Not please, not can you. Just a command, clean, cold, and final. You're told to do something, not asked, not reasoned with. And maybe it's small, maybe it's simple. Pick that up, sit down, be quiet. But something shifts. There's a tension that wasn't there before. A quiet tightening beneath the surface. Because the command doesn't just ask for action, it demands submission. And that's when free will begins to slip. Not all at once, not dramatically. It dissolves in silence like a sugar cube in warm water. You still feel like you're choosing. You still believe you're deciding. But the moment the command is spoken, a new logic enters your mind. A new pressure forms behind your thoughts. You begin weighing consequences that didn't exist a second ago. What happens if you refuse? What if you don't obey? You imagine the look on their face. You anticipate disapproval, punishment, disappointment. You start to calculate not what you want, but what they expect, what they might do, what will happen to you if you resist. The choice no longer feels clean. It's cluttered now with fear, with doubt, with shame. And so you obey, or you don't. But either way, something inside you is already changed. The decision you make is no longer purely yours. It's shaped, nudged, altered by the presence of that voice. Now, imagine the voice comes from someone in power, a uniform, a title, a higher rank. You're in a system where obedience is expected, rewarded, enforced. The command is no longer one voice. It's a structure, a hierarchy, a rule book wrapped in a human face. And here, something more dangerous begins. You stop asking whether the command is right. You stop wondering if the action aligns with your values. Because you've been told, and the person telling you, well, they must know more, they must have reasons, they must be responsible. Not you. Responsibility begins to slide down the chain. Each person obeying the next, no one questioning, no one resisting, each one just following orders, passing them along, never stopping to see where they lead. This is how ordinary people do terrible things. Not because they enjoy harm, but because the voice said, obey, and they didn't stop to ask why. You might think you'd be different, that you'd resist, that you'd question, but you don't know what that moment feels like. Not until you're in it. Not until the pressure is real, the command is loud, and your instincts are screaming to survive, to conform, to belong. Because disobedience doesn't just risk punishment, it risks alienation, judgment, being seen as difficult, insubordinate, wrong. We're taught early that good people follow rules, that obedience is virtue, that compliance keeps the peace. So when the voice tells you to do something, even something that feels wrong, you hesitate. Not because you agree, but because disobedience feels dangerous. You start to convince yourself that it's not that bad, that someone else would do it anyway, that you're not really responsible, that maybe you misunderstood. You find a dozen ways to blur the edge between right and wrong, until the command no longer feels like a threat, just a duty. And the longer you follow orders, the easier it gets. Each act of obedience dulls your sense of agency. Each repetition makes you more comfortable with silence, more willing to set aside your doubt, until one day the command doesn't even feel like a command. It just feels like the way things are. And your free will, it's still there, technically, but it's buried, disused, weak. It still flickers when something feels truly wrong. It still tugs at you when a line is crossed. But by then, you're part of something larger, a system, a process. You feel trapped, even when you're free. You think about the consequences of saying no. You imagine the fallout, the disruption, the risk, and you tell yourself it's too late, that you don't have a choice, that someone else should speak up instead. And the voice wins again, not because it's powerful, but because you've forgotten how to disobey. You start to see that free will doesn't disappear with violence. It disappears with subtlety, with the quiet normalization of authority, with small compromises repeated over time, with every moment you choose safety over truth. And now you're left wondering how many of your decisions were really yours. How many times did you obey without thinking? How many lines did you cross because someone else told you to? And when the next voice says, obey, what will you do? Will you question it? Resist it? Or will you feel that familiar tightening in your chest, that quiet fear, and step forward anyway? Because the most unsettling truth isn't that obedience can lead to evil. It's that it doesn't feel evil when you're doing it. It just feels like the next step, the next task, the next rule to follow. And by the time you realize what you've become, the voice is already gone, and you're still obeying. Would you rather hear that you're loved or know deep down that you're not? Most people say they want the truth. They say it instinctively, like it's obvious, like it's noble. But when the truth begins to hurt, when it cuts through what you've built, how quickly does that certainty dissolve? You say you'd want to know if your partner was lying, if your friends were pretending, if your parents never really understood you. But if the truth dismantles the only version of love you've ever known, would you still want it? Because here's what happens. Someone tells you what you want to hear. They say you're important, that you're doing well, that everything is going to be okay, and it soothes you. It helps you sleep. You stop questioning. You feel secure again. And even if something inside you whispers that it's not real, you don't press. You don't ask. Because the lie does its job. Comfort has a weight to it. It drapes over you like a blanket. Even when you know it isn't real, it's still warm. And sometimes that warmth matters more than accuracy. But then you start to notice something, that your sense of self isn't solid anymore. It shifts under your feet. Because when you're surrounded by lies, even kind ones, you lose track of what's real. You stop trusting your instincts. You second-guess your memories. You feel safe, but hollow, like a photograph of a person who used to be alive. And here's the trap. Once you've tasted that comfort, truth starts to feel like an attack. If someone pulls back the curtain and shows you what's really happening, how people see you, how far you've fallen, how little you're understood, it doesn't feel clarifying, it feels cruel. You begin to resist. You defend the lie, not because it's better, but because it's familiar, because it allows you to function, because it protects the fragile story you're clinging to. But now you're stuck. Because even if the lie helps you survive, it also isolates you. No one truly knows you, not even yourself. You're performing a version of you that was built around what others needed you to be. And every day you reinforce it. Every compliment you accept. Every smile you force. Every silence you maintain. You tell yourself you're doing it for peace, for harmony, for love, but somewhere, quietly, you know you're doing it to avoid collapse. Because the truth, if faced fully, might break you. What if they never loved you? What if they never respected you? What if they stayed because it was easy, or because they didn't know how to leave? What if you're not as kind as you think? What if you're not as strong? What if the version of you that others admire is built entirely on things you've learned to hide? You could ask, you could demand honesty, you could pull at the threads until the whole thing unravels. But once it does, there's no going back. Once you see the truth, even just a glimpse, it haunts everything, so you choose not to. You pretend not to notice. You let the words wash over you, the reassurances, the praise, the carefully edited affection. And you nod and smile and say thank you. Even when you know it's not the full story, and maybe that's how most people live. Not in total denial, but in selective blindness. Just enough truth to feel grounded. Just enough illusion to keep going. Never fully awake, never fully asleep. But here's the part that stings. Every time you accept the lie, you lose something. A sliver of self-respect. A fragment of clarity. A tiny piece of who you really are. And over time, those pieces add up. Until one day you look in the mirror, and you don't recognize the person looking back. You've become someone whose life is built on words that aren't true. Whose love is sustained by silence. Whose identity depends on everyone else, never telling the truth. And maybe that's what you feared most. Not the truth itself, but the version of you that might emerge if the truth was known. Not the discomfort of being seen, but the terror that once you were, no one would stay. So you protect the illusion. You rehearse it daily. You call it kindness. You call it strength. You call it love. But underneath, there's a quieter truth. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken. You chose the lie. And part of you knows you always will. What breaks first? Your ethics or your instincts? You think you know the answer. You think morality is firm, that when the moment comes, you'll hold the line, that values don't shift under pressure. But what happens when fear arrives? Pure, physical, consuming fear. Not the fear of guilt or judgment or philosophical failure. The kind that lives in your spine, that hijacks your breath, that turns every moral ideal into a luxury you suddenly can't afford. Think about how you act when you're safe. It's easy to be kind. It's easy to be just. It's easy to imagine yourself as brave, as good when the danger is somewhere else. But what if you're not watching the danger? What if it's watching you? What if it's inches away, and your next decision might be the difference between life and death, not someone else's life? Yours. You want to believe fear clarifies, that it sharpens your sense of what's right. But fear doesn't clarify, it narrows. It collapses the world down to one thought. Survive. Everything else gets smaller. Principles, beliefs, other people. In fear, nothing is sacred. You tell yourself you'd never betray your values. You'd never turn your back on someone in need. You'd never lie, or flee, or sacrifice an innocent to save yourself. But those are words said in warmth, in comfort, in control. What do those words become when your body no longer listens to your mind? Imagine someone begging you for help, and you know helping them puts you in danger. Maybe not certain danger, just a possibility. That's all it takes. You feel it rise in you, not cruelty, not hate, just self-preservation, a calculation. One you don't want to admit you're making. If you help them, you might suffer. If you walk away, you might be fine. You hesitate. And in that hesitation, something breaks. Not all at once. It breaks quietly, subtly. You might still think you're moral. You might still say the right things. But inside, you've already shifted. You've placed your safety above their suffering. You've decided, even if you can't quite say it aloud, that morality has limits, that your life matters more. Now imagine the fear grows. It's not just possibility anymore. It's real, tangible. The threat is close. You're no longer choosing between good and evil. You're choosing between action and paralysis. And action now might mean hurting someone, or turning someone in, or standing by while someone else is harmed. And the voice in your head doesn't say this is wrong. It says you'll die if you don't. You begin to understand how fear creates permission, not just to act, but to justify. You tell yourself it's temporary, necessary, that you'll go back to who you were once it's over. But some things don't reverse. Some choices don't leave. You think morality is something you carry into every situation, but maybe it's something that only exists when you feel safe enough to use it. Think of people in history. Not monsters, not villains, just ordinary people, living through terrifying times. What would you have done in their place? Not what you hope. What would you actually do if fear had hollowed you out, if survival meant obedience, if silence meant safety? You've judged them. But maybe you've never faced what they faced. Maybe you've never been afraid enough to find out who you are when fear decides for you and when it's over. If it ever ends, what do you tell yourself? That you had no choice. That anyone would have done the same. That you didn't mean it. You will want forgiveness. But forgiveness can't restore what fear destroyed. Especially if what it destroyed wasn't just a single act, but your belief in yourself. Because fear doesn't just make you do something bad. It makes you realize something worse. That morality isn't who you are. It's who you are when nothing's at stake. And when everything is at stake, you might not recognize yourself at all. And that's the part no one wants to say out loud. That maybe the line between good and evil isn't as clear as you thought. Maybe it's not a line at all. Maybe it's a temperature, a pressure point, a moment when something inside you says, not this time, not today. I need to live. And the most terrifying part isn't what fear makes you do. It's how easily you live with it afterward. Why would someone choose to spend their life in medicine, not out of compassion, but out of the desire to control? Not control disease, not control outcomes, but people. Imagine this: a patient sits across from you, vulnerable, frightened, unsure. They're trusting you. They're relying on you to tell them what's wrong, what to do, how to live. In that moment, you have something most people never experience: authority over another person's body, over their choices, over what happens next. For some, that moment is sacred. It demands care, empathy, restraint. But for others, it's the moment they crave. The moment they feel power settle into their hands like a scalpel. They won't say it out loud. They don't need to. It's in how they speak, how they interrupt, how they frame decisions as inevitable, how they expect obedience, how they measure respect by compliance. They aren't drawn to medicine to heal, they're drawn to command. At first, it looks like confidence, precision, decisiveness. But slowly you notice the signs, the way disagreement is treated as defiance, the way fear in patients is dismissed, reframed as irrational, the way their decisions are overridden, again and again, always for the best. You start to realize something deeper. It was never about the patient, never about their experience. It was about the doctor's sense of control, their comfort in being the final authority, their need to be obeyed. And maybe you wonder, why choose medicine? Of all things, why not the military, or politics, or law? Why healing? Because here, power wears a mask of altruism, of nobility, of sacrifice. You can exert absolute control and still be praised for your virtue. Here, Obedience is framed as trust. Authority is cloaked in care. And who would question that? Who would accuse a doctor of dominance when everything they do is framed as saving lives? When every act of control can be justified by urgency, by necessity, by outcomes. But control isn't just about what's done, it's about how it feels, to be the one who knows, to be the one who decides, to hold someone's life in your hands and watch them defer to you completely. That feeling becomes addictive, and like all addictions, it begins to shape behavior. You start seeing patients not as individuals, but as problems to be solved, as obstacles to be managed. You resent their questions. You dread their resistance. You stop listening. And worse, you start seeing their bodies as territory, as objects to cut, to fix, to own. You begin to speak of my patient, my case, my protocol. Their autonomy dissolves into your agenda. Their pain becomes your inconvenience. Not every doctor is like this, but some are. And the system doesn't just tolerate it, it rewards it. Because control often looks like competence. Detachment looks like clarity. And obedience from patience is easy to mistake for trust. You might wonder, do they know what they've become? Do they understand what drives them? Maybe not. Maybe they entered medicine for all the right reasons, and something shifted along the way. Or maybe deep down, this was always the goal. A life where people listen, where decisions aren't debated, where every room you enter is shaped by your will. They'll say it's about outcomes, about standards of care, about evidence. But underneath all that, there's a quiet hunger, not to help, but to dominate, not to understand suffering, but to direct it. And maybe the most unsettling part is how easily that hunger hides in plain sight, how fluently it speaks the language of healing, how comfortable it feels in white coats and surgical gloves. You sit across from this person. You try to explain your symptoms, your fears, your confusion, and something in their eyes tells you it doesn't matter. The decision's already been made because they don't need you to feel better. They need you to obey, and in that moment, you realize the power you gave them wasn't earned. It was taken, quietly, automatically, as if it belonged to them all along. And maybe that's the real danger, not the mistakes they make, not the procedures they perform, but the way they disappear inside the role, the way they believe, completely, that control is care, that obedience is healing, that power is medicine. What makes mind control terrifying isn't how forceful it feels, it's how peaceful it is. It doesn't rip you open or chain you down. It doesn't scream or demand. It whispers, it soothes. It makes you feel like the decisions were yours all along. The ideas enter slowly, wrapped in kindness, embedded in repetition, until you start to confuse influence with choice. And once that happens, you don't resist. You agree. At first, it feels like understanding, like clarity. You're drawn to the way it simplifies everything. Conflict fades, doubt dissolves. The confusion you used to carry around like a weight is suddenly gone. You know what to think. You know who to trust. You feel calm, aligned. Certain that's how it begins. Because the human mind doesn't fight what feels good. It opens to it. It cooperates. And when control arrives with a smile instead of a threat, there's no obvious moment to defend yourself. No clear line being crossed. Just a series of small, reasonable steps, each one slightly easier to accept than the last. You don't even notice that something's being taken, that parts of you are disappearing. Your doubts, your instincts, your sense of contradiction. All of it softens, slips away quietly, not stolen, offered, willingly. You say the words they taught you. You believe the things they reward. You avoid the questions they avoid. And slowly, your internal voice, the one that used to interrupt, begins to fade. You don't feel erased. You feel content, cooperative, safe. That's what makes it dangerous. Real control doesn't look like domination. It looks like relief. It feels like being held after years of uncertainty. You stop looking for exit signs because it never felt like a trap. You stop asking questions because the answers were already given, not forced on you, just placed gently in your path, again and again, until they seemed like your own. And then, without realizing it, you start defending the thing that holds you. You start explaining why it's right, why it's good, why anyone who resists it must be confused or broken or dangerous. You become the voice of your own control. You become its agent, its protector. You believe you're helping. You believe you're free. But the thoughts you hold most tightly, the convictions you won't examine, where did they come from? Can you trace them back? Did you ever choose them? Or were they given to you, piece by piece, until they fit perfectly where your questions used to be? And if you can't remember deciding, does that mean you never did? You begin to realize that control isn't about force. It's about shaping what people want, what they fear, what they think will make them good. If someone can make you want what they want, they don't need to imprison you. You'll walk into the cell yourself, proudly, gratefully. You'll decorate it, call it freedom. And even now, you may feel resistant to this thought. You may be thinking about other people, weaker minds, not yours. But that's part of it too. The belief that you would know, that you'd see it coming, that you'd feel it happening. That's what makes it work, because you don't resist what you don't recognize, and you don't recognize what feels like agreement. So maybe the scariest part of mind control isn't that it steals your thoughts. It's that it replaces them so gently, so lovingly, that you thank it for doing so. Maybe the real horror isn't being manipulated, it's never knowing you were. What if evil doesn't look like violence? What if it doesn't shout, threaten, or intimidate? What if it smiles gently, nods politely, holds the door open, and says all the right things? What if it thanks you for your time, listens patiently, and compliments your children? Would you recognize it? Imagine you're in a room full of well-dressed people. They're successful, educated, refined. They speak with measured voices. They sip wine slowly, laugh in soft tones, and ask about your weekend. The room is warm, bright, safe. Nothing here feels dangerous. But somewhere in that room, someone is quietly deciding who deserves to suffer, who should be excluded, dismissed, punished, not out of rage, but out of principle. And everyone else nods, not because they're cruel, but because the words are careful, the logic is clean, the tone is reasonable. No one is shouting, no one is being forced. It's all voluntary, civil, polite. That's the part that unsettles you. Evil presented without heat, without urgency, without the discomfort you expect. Because when evil wears a mask of civility, you don't flinch, you listen, you trust, you relax. And that's when it starts to grow, not in the darkness, but in plain sight. You're used to thinking of evil as monstrous, as something that breaks the rules. But sometimes it follows them perfectly. Sometimes it builds the rules, writes the policies, sends the emails. It doesn't need to raise its voice. It only needs to make you feel like everything is fine. It thrives in well-lit boardrooms, in quiet meetings, in calm, orderly procedures. No violence, just signatures, just protocol, just decisions. The kind that ripple outward, slowly, invisibly, until someone far away suffers for a choice made here, today, by someone who smiled when they made it. You expect evil to feel wrong. But what if it doesn't? What if it feels productive, necessary, even kind? What if the most harmful decisions are made by people who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing? What if the worst outcomes aren't driven by hatred, but by order, tradition, policy? What if no one in the room ever wanted to cause harm, but harm was caused anyway? You start to feel uneasy because you've been in rooms like that. You've heard those conversations. You've nodded along. Maybe you didn't agree completely, but you didn't say anything either. You stayed quiet, professional, respectful, because it wasn't your place. Because it wasn't your place. Because you didn't want to be difficult. Because the people in the room were just doing their jobs. That's how it spreads. Not through chaos, but through stability. Not through villains, but through neighbors, co-workers, friends. Through people who would never raise a hand in anger, but who will raise one in a vote. Through people who do not feel cruel and do not look cruel and would be deeply offended if you suggested they were anything but fair. You begin to realize something, that evil doesn't need to corrupt people. It just needs them to be obedient, to follow rules, to protect the system, to care more about appearances than outcomes, to care more about civility than conscience. It doesn't hide in shadows, it hides in routines, in good manners, in polite language, in the comforting rhythms of normal life. It hides in moments where you feel proud to be reasonable, mature, restrained. When you tell yourself it's better to be calm than confrontational, better to be respectful than disruptive, better to wait, to defer, to let things unfold naturally. But sometimes waiting is the crime. Sometimes evil survives precisely because no one wants to disturb the peace. Because people are more afraid of being rude than being complicit. Because they trust that someone else, somewhere, will speak up. Just not them, not now, not here. You think you'd recognize evil, but what if the truth is simpler and darker? What if evil doesn't look like the worst of us? What if it looks like the most polite, the most professional, the most composed? What if the most dangerous people are the ones who never raise their voices, only their expectations? And what if you've already said yes to them, more times than you can count, because they asked nicely? What happens when the powerless finally gain power? Do they become something better or something worse? At first, they speak with clarity. They know exactly what injustice looks like because they've lived it. They remember the names, the faces, the betrayals. They carry the sharp memory of being silenced, dismissed, overlooked. Their anger feels pure, righteous, necessary, and maybe it is. But something begins to change the moment the tables turn. They begin by correcting the wrongs. They speak louder, stand taller, demand fairness. But the longer they hold power, the more their actions begin to shift from justice to control. They start making rules, then exceptions, then enemies. At some point, it stops being about fairness. It becomes about fear. Fear of losing what they finally gained. Fear of being made powerless again. And so they begin to punish, not just those who oppress them, but anyone who threatens their hold, no matter how small the threat is. They tell themselves it's different, that their power is used for good, that it's necessary. But the lines blur quickly. The words they once hated, order, discipline, loyalty, become the language they now use. The tactics they once suffered, manipulation, shame, coercion, become the tools they now wield. And what's worse is how invisible the transformation feels. They don't wake up one day and decide to become what they despised. It happens in pieces. Quiet compromises, subtle justifications, small moments where fear overrides empathy, where safety becomes more important than principle. Eventually, they forget what it felt like to be the one without power. They forget the desperation, the silence, the helplessness. And when someone beneath them tries to speak up, when someone tries to say, "This isn't right," they react with suspicion, not recognition. They see threat, not reflection. And so the cycle begins again. Because power doesn't just reveal character, it reshapes it. It replaces the old fear with a new one. It whispers that the only way to stay safe is to stay in control. That kindness is weakness. That doubt is danger. And slowly, those who were once victims begin to look very much like the people who once hurt them. But maybe the most disturbing part isn't that power corrupts. Maybe it's that it seduces. It doesn't force you to become cruel. It invites you. It rewards you. It tells you that you've earned this, that you deserve this, that those beneath you wouldn't understand the burden you carry, that they wouldn't know how hard it is to lead. It flatters you until you stop seeing yourself clearly. You stop asking hard questions. You stop checking your motives. You stop listening. And now you're no longer protecting yourself from harm. You're protecting yourself from accountability. You use your past pain as armor, as justification. You say, "I suffered, so I understand." But what you mean is, "I suffered, so I'm entitled." And eventually, the people beneath you begin to whisper the same things you once whispered. They say, "This isn't fair." They say, "This isn't right." They say they've become the very thing they once fought against. And they're talking about you. The pain you once carried hasn't disappeared. It's just been buried beneath layers of control. It's still there, shaping your decisions, driving your fear. But now it's hidden behind power, and power doesn't heal. It only conceals. You used to believe that suffering made you better, more compassionate, more just. But maybe it didn't. Maybe it only taught you how to disguise cruelty as necessity. And now, the person you once promised you'd never become, the person who silenced you, hurt you, dismissed you, is looking back at you in the mirror. And maybe the reason you can't look away is because you finally understand them. How many times have you explained yourself calmly, logically, rationally, without realizing that every explanation was a small betrayal? Not a betrayal of others, a betrayal of who you used to be. It starts innocently. You make a decision you wouldn't have made a year ago. You say it's necessary. You say circumstances changed. You say you didn't have a choice, and maybe that's true. But then it happens again. Another small shift, another minor compromise, and again you explain it. You tell yourself it's justified, that it's still aligned with your values, that you're just adapting. But the explanations pile up, each one a quiet rewriting of the rules you used to live by, each one a way to make the mirror less painful to look into. You think you're staying the same, you think you're just adjusting, but what if those adjustments are the change? What if the person you were would look at you now and not understand? It's difficult to notice while it's happening. The change is subtle. It doesn't arrive with drama or ceremony. It happens slowly, beneath your awareness, like a tide pulling you a few inches farther from shore every day. And every time you feel uneasy, every time a decision leaves a faint trace of discomfort, you reach for the same solution, an explanation. You remind yourself why it was okay, why it was necessary, why it doesn't mean anything about who you are. But in doing so, you silence the voice that used to keep you honest. You're not lying. You believe the things you say. That's the problem. Because the more convincing your justifications become, the harder it is to see how far you've drifted. You used to hold certain lines. You used to have boundaries that felt absolute. Not because they were written down, but because they lived in you. And now you cross those lines, not recklessly, but carefully, cautiously, with reasons. And that makes it feel safe. You think if you can explain something, it must be right. But maybe the ability to explain isn't proof of integrity. Maybe it's just proof that you've become very good at avoiding the truth. And if someone were to ask you directly, have you changed? You'd say no. You'd point to your intentions, your principles, your core beliefs. You'd talk about complexity, about how nothing is black and white, about how context matters, and it does. But if you could watch yourself from the outside, if you could see the accumulation of choices, the quiet shifting of your values over time, what would you notice? Would you see someone becoming more open-minded, more adaptive? Or would you see someone losing track of themselves, piece by piece? And when did it start? Was it the first time you stayed silent when you should have spoken up? The first time you helped someone for the wrong reasons? The first time you saw something wrong and told yourself it wasn't your place? Whatever the moment was, you probably didn't mark it. You didn't think it was significant. It was just one moment, one decision, one justification. But that's how it always begins. You don't change all at once. You change by degrees, hidden inside choices that feel necessary, even noble. And the more you explain, the less you examine. The more you rationalize, the less you remember what your instincts used to tell you. Until one day, you're standing in the middle of your life, certain that you've stayed true to yourself, while being unable to name what yourself even means anymore. And here's the part that should scare you most. You may never know it happened because each change made sense at the time. Each shift felt reasonable. And no one else stopped you. No one else noticed. No one else cared. You were the only one watching. And you stopped paying attention, not because you didn't care, but because it was easier to believe that nothing had changed than to face the possibility that something had. You'll keep telling yourself you're still the same, that your decisions are just practical, that your morals haven't moved. They've matured, that the world is different now, that the rules don't apply the way they used to. And maybe that's true, or maybe you've just learned how to talk yourself into anything. And now the question isn't whether you've changed. The question is, how long ago did it happen? And why didn't you notice? Imagine you're strapped to a chair, not violently, calmly, methodically. The restraints aren't painful, they're snug, clinical. Someone is adjusting dials nearby. Their voice is soft, measured. They say this is a study. They say it's for science, for understanding, for progress. You feel the electrodes on your skin. You feel the machine hum. And you start to wonder, not about what's happening, but about what they had to sign to make it happen. Because somewhere there's a form, a protocol, a set of approvals, signatures, legal phrases, words like minimal risk, necessary distress, controlled conditions. Somewhere this exact moment was written down, predicted, reviewed. Someone signed off. And that's what makes it feel worse. It's not that what's happening to you is unexpected. It's that it was anticipated, planned, that the pain, confusion, fear you feel right now passed through the hands of a committee, a checklist, a rubber stamp. There's no villain here, no screaming torturer, just a calm technician, a clipboard, a rationale. That's what divides an experiment from torture. Not intention, not method, not even impact, just process, just paperwork. And once you see that line, you start to see how thin it really is. Imagine the person adjusting those dials doesn't hate you, doesn't even think about you, really. They're focused on data, on consistency, on ensuring the right variables are controlled. The pain you feel is a necessary side effect, unfortunate, but informative. The ethics board said it was acceptable. The discomfort won't be permanent. The results will help others. That's the logic, and maybe they're right. Maybe your suffering will lead to something good. Maybe your fear will be translated into insight, and your reactions will guide future safety protocols. But in this moment, does that matter to you? You start to realize the disturbing truth. The justification for harm doesn't change the harm itself. Pain experienced for a noble reason still feels like pain, and then the contradiction deepens. If they pulled out your fingernails without asking, we'd call it torture. But if they expose you to high-pitched noise and monitor your stress hormones, it's research. If they strap you down in a dark room for 8 hours to see how isolation affects cognition, it's a study. If they do it without purpose, it's abuse. Purpose is the difference. But purpose is just a story we tell. It's a reason we write down, rehearse, and repeat until it sounds acceptable. And you realize how easy it is to cross the line. Not by doing more harm, but by writing better paperwork. By framing pain as productive. By calling trauma stimulus and calling suffering data. Now ask yourself this: if the pain is real, if the fear is real, if the suffering is indistinguishable from what we'd call torture in any other setting, does the label change anything, or does it just make us feel better? Because the line between experiment and torture isn't drawn in blood or broken bones. It's drawn in language, in euphemisms, in documentation. And what does that mean for you? It means your consent might not matter as much as you think. It means your well-being could be secondary to a hypothesis. It means someone could watch you tremble, scream, dissociate, and still believe they're doing something good, still believe they're on the right side. And maybe that's what's most unsettling. Not the suffering itself, but the calm around it. The belief that because a study was approved, nothing terrible is happening. That because a procedure followed ethical guidelines, no one is being harmed. That because it's science, it can't be cruelty. But cruelty isn't defined by intention. It's defined by experience. And once you start to see that, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how easy it is to design pain that's justifiable. How easy it is to say minimal risk when the risk is someone else's body. How easy it is to hurt people when you're gathering information. You wonder how often this happens. Not just in labs, but in offices, in governments, in schools, in homes. People experiencing harm while the system insists it's necessary. People being hurt while the paperwork insists it's fine. And you feel a chill when you realize this. The person with the clipboard doesn't have to be evil. They just have to believe what they're doing is useful. And if they can believe that, if they can call it study, progress, optimization, then they can sleep at night. Even if you can't. Would you admit it? If you enjoyed watching someone fail, not someone you hate, not someone who hurt you, just someone close enough to compare yourself to. A friend, a peer, someone whose success reminds you of your own shortcomings. Would you smile, even a little, when they stumble? You probably wouldn't show it. You'd say the right things. Offer comfort, pretend to be surprised, but somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a flicker of relief. A sense of balance restored, because for a moment their failure makes your own life feel easier to bear. It doesn't take horns or cruelty to feel that way. It doesn't mean you're evil. It just means you're human, and that's what makes it worse. You don't need to wish harm on others. You just need to see their downfall as a kind of quiet permission. Permission to stop striving, to stop comparing, to feel like maybe you're not so far behind after all. It's easy to think of evil as something extreme, something monstrous. But sometimes it's subtle. It whispers instead of screams. It blends into things we're taught to admire: competitiveness, ambition, honesty. We learn to dress it up as fairness, as justice, as truth. But underneath, it's the same hunger to feel better by watching someone else fall. And it happens quietly. You don't notice it at first. You hear about someone's bad news, and for a moment you pause, not in sympathy, but in secret satisfaction. You remind yourself it's natural, that it's not your fault, they failed. But the feeling stays. It lingers. You start to crave it. Not openly, but enough that you check. You watch. You scan their updates, their stories, their moments of pride, waiting for the cracks to show. Not because you want them to suffer, but because you want to stop feeling so far behind. And their pain becomes your relief. You don't have to push anyone down. You just have to hope they don't climb higher than you. And when they don't, when they slip or falter, you feel safe again. For a little while, you feel level. But then it deepens. You start to expect it. You stop celebrating their wins, even when they matter. You dismiss their success, look for flaws, question their intentions. You reduce them to a mirror, useful only to reflect how you feel about yourself. And when they shine too brightly, the mirror burns. You might not act on it. You might never say a word, but the damage is already done. Not to them, to you. You start living in quiet opposition, measuring your worth not by your own growth, but by someone else's decline. And you begin to need their failure more than you need your own progress. That's where it takes root. Not in what you do, but in what you feed. That tiny, bitter satisfaction. That fragile sense of justice. When someone more talented, more admired, more lucky finally trips. You don't celebrate their pain, you just welcome the silence it brings. And maybe you tell yourself it's fair, that they had it too easy, that they didn't deserve it as much as you. But that's not truth. That's just your own disappointment, rephrased as morality. Their failure doesn't fix your life. It just hides your envy for a moment longer. You begin to resent anyone who reminds you of what you haven't done. Anyone who rises too quickly, too smoothly, too far. You start to believe the world is unfair, not because others suffer, but because they don't suffer enough. And you forget how to wish someone well without wanting something back. You lose track of what you actually want. All your goals turn into comparisons. Every step forward is only meaningful if someone else is falling behind. Your identity becomes reactive, built around shadows, never fully yours. And that's how quiet evil spreads. Not through cruelty or violence, but through the slow erosion of goodwill, the loss of joy in others' joy, the growing belief that someone else's happiness must come at your expense. You don't need to do anything wrong to become part of it. You just need to keep feeding that small, quiet feeling, the one that tells you softly that you are only okay because someone else is not. And eventually, you stop noticing when it happens. You feel it, but you don't question it. It becomes normal. It becomes invisible. And you carry it with you, silently, into every interaction, every relationship, every passing thought. Because the most unsettling part isn't that you feel it, it's how easily you justify it. How quickly it feels deserved. How quietly it rewrites who you are. You don't need horns to enjoy watching others fail. You just need to stop noticing that you do. Would you still feel the same if the sun was setting behind him? If the crowd were cheering, the sky painted with color, the camera slowly circling the platform, would you still see a man dying, or would you see justice being done? Executions are supposed to be solemn, grim, a necessary evil. But something strange happens when you add an audience. When people gather, when the atmosphere feels right, something ancient and hidden begins to stir. The discomfort fades, replaced by something more primal, not hate, not fear, excitement. You might tell yourself you're only there to witness justice, that you're observing, not celebrating. But listen to the rhythm of the crowd, the way people lean forward, the flicker of anticipation in their eyes. They're not grieving, they're waiting. Imagine being in that crowd. You don't shout, you don't chant, but you stay, you don't look away. The man climbs the steps, his hands bound. The moment slows. The sun hits him just right, casting him in gold. You feel something rising inside you. Not pity, not sorrow, something else. A sense of righteousness. A feeling that this is how it's supposed to be. But if you strip away the setting, the timing, the light, what's left? A human being is about to die. And the truth is, it's easier to accept that death, when it's framed correctly, when the execution feels cinematic, almost symbolic. The more beautiful the scene, the more justified it seems. We call it justice, but often we just want it to feel right. We want the ending to match the story. We want the final moment to satisfy something in us. That's why the lighting matters. Now, imagine if everything went wrong, the weather turned. The executioner stumbled. The man cried, begged, collapsed in fear. How quickly the mood would shift. How fast that righteousness would turn sour. People wouldn't call it justice then. They'd call it a disgrace, a failure. Not because the outcome changed, but because the aesthetic did. The execution is the same. A life ended by deliberate force. But the reaction depends on tone, atmosphere, framing. You start to realize justice isn't being felt, it's being performed. Think about how easily that performance sways you. How a simple change in lighting can shape your emotions, your convictions. You don't just see an execution, you see a moment that feels earned, inevitable, almost sacred. And so you stop asking whether it should happen. You just let it happen, because it feels right. But what if that feeling is the problem? What if the cheering crowd isn't proof of justice, but evidence of something darker? A hunger, long buried. A willingness to feel pleasure at another person's end, as long as it's presented well, as long as the music swells and the framing is perfect. You might think you'd never cheer, that you'd be horrified, silent. But emotion doesn't always start with a decision. It starts with a feeling, subtle and small, a flicker of satisfaction, a breath of relief. And by the time you notice it, it's already there. You didn't choose it, but you let it grow. And if you do feel something, excitement, relief, even joy, what does that say about you? What does it mean when you feel good watching someone else die? Not because you hate them, not because they harmed you, but because the moment feels right, because the lighting is perfect. You start to understand something awful, that maybe our sense of morality isn't as solid as we think. Maybe it can be shaped by something as simple as atmosphere. Maybe we're not horrified by violence itself, but only by violence done badly. And when it's done well, when it's done beautifully, maybe we even enjoy it. You won't admit that out loud. No one will. But think about how often we watch suffering dressed up as spectacle. Violence in film. Revenge as catharsis. We cheer for the death of villains, not because justice is done, but because the timing is perfect. The line is delivered. The music swells. It feels earned. But in real life, death is never cinematic. There's no perfect frame, no swelling soundtrack. Just a body and silence, and people pretending to feel solemn, pretending to be witnesses when what they are spectators. And maybe that's the most disturbing part. Not that executions happen, not even that people watch, but that something inside us wants them to feel beautiful. Because if they do, we don't have to question them. We don't have to feel guilty. We don't have to look too closely. We just call it justice and cheer quietly, as long as the lighting is right. What if they aren't monsters at all? What if every horror you've ever heard about, every act that left you disgusted, afraid, certain of someone's inhumanity, wasn't committed by a monster, but by a human being just like you? Not some separate species, not some aberration, just someone in a different place, under different pressure, facing a different set of circumstances. And if that's true, then how far are you, really, from becoming them? We like to think the line is clear, that there's an unbreakable boundary between good people and bad ones. That evil is something outside of us, a foreign infection we can spot and reject. But reality doesn't work that way. Morality isn't a trait, it's a context, a shifting environment, a fragile structure that collapses when the wrong variables align. Think about fear. Not the fear you feel watching a movie or hearing a strange noise at night. Real fear, the kind that takes over your body, silences your thoughts, and reduces you to instinct. How do you behave when you're terrified? What would you do if someone you love was in danger, and violence felt like the only solution? Would you still recognize yourself, or consider desperation? Not wanting more money or attention, but real desperation, starvation, isolation, hopelessness. What rules do you think would still matter to you then? How many moral lines are you confident you wouldn't cross if survival was at stake? You probably believe there are some things you could never do, that no matter how bad things got, some acts would remain unthinkable. But everyone who's done those things thought the same once. No one wakes up believing they'll become a villain. People cross lines slowly, step by step, each one justified by something urgent, necessary, or just less painful than the alternative. Sometimes it's not even pain that distorts behavior. Sometimes it's authority. How often do people do harm just because they're told to? Not because they want to. Not because they believe it's right, but because it's easier. Because saying no would bring punishment, rejection, humiliation. People obey orders that disgust them because disobedience feels more dangerous than guilt. Other times, it's anonymity, being part of a crowd, being hidden, the sense that no one is watching, that blame will be shared or avoided entirely. People who would never act violently alone can become cruel in groups. Not because they changed, but because they stopped feeling responsible. And what about belief? Conviction? How many atrocities have been committed in the name of righteousness? When people believe they're fighting for a just cause, when they're certain they're the good ones, violence doesn't just become acceptable, it becomes necessary. Even noble, they don't feel guilt, they feel pride. You might say that's different. That true morality means resisting those pressures, that some people do hold the line. But the ones who don't, they're not monsters, they're not freaks, they're people. People who were scared or desperate or deceived. People who were told they were doing the right thing. People who thought they had no choice. People who in some quiet moment realized they'd gone too far, but couldn't turn back. You still want the separation to exist. You want to believe you're better, that nothing could turn you into one of them. But if morality is just context, if cruelty is situational, if kindness depends on pressure, then who are you without those conditions? Are you good because you are, or because you've never had to prove it? Maybe the truth is this: monsters don't exist. They're a story we tell to make sense of evil without facing the possibility that it's human, that it's ordinary, that it lives closer than we think. Because if evil isn't something separate, then the boundary between you and the worst people in history is thinner than you're willing to admit. Just a handful of events, a few desperate moments, one wrong context. And if that's true, then you're not just capable of good, you're also capable of everything else. What if your mind isn't trying to protect you from danger, but from the truth? Imagine this: You're convinced someone is out to get you, not in an obvious way. Just a lingering feeling, a glance that lasts too long, a phrase that sounds too carefully chosen. Your mind begins to build a story, a pattern. You start connecting things. Is this person hiding something? Are they manipulating you? Suddenly, suspicion blooms into certainty. You know what they are, you know what they're doing, and in your head, it's all perfectly clear. But what if none of it is real? What if everything your mind is showing you, every warning, every red flag, is a distraction? Not from them, but from yourself. Sometimes the enemy is too close to be seen. It's not the other person. It's not the situation. It's the part of you that refuses to face something. A truth, a memory, a choice. Something small, maybe, but unbearable. And so, your mind invents something bigger, something worse. A threat, a villain, a devil. Because it's easier to fight an enemy than to face regret. Easier to see evil outside yourself than to admit what you've ignored, what you've done, what you've become. You might think you're seeing the world clearly, but you're not. You're seeing through a filter, one that distorts reality just enough to protect you, just enough to hide what you're not ready to admit. You tell yourself it's intuition, a gut feeling, but it's not. It's a defense mechanism, a mask. Your mind is keeping you away from something raw, something sharp. It doesn't always look like paranoia. Sometimes it looks like righteousness, like anger. You believe you're standing for truth, for justice. You feel outraged, betrayed. You point fingers, raise your voice, demand accountability. But underneath, quietly, there's something else. A fear that if you stop yelling, you'll hear something you don't want to hear. That maybe the betrayal wasn't theirs, maybe it was yours. This is how we create devils. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. We invent them to explain our pain, to give our suffering a shape. Because a world where someone is to blame is easier than a world where no one is. Or worse, a world where the blame belongs to us. And the longer we do this, the more convincing the illusion becomes. We stop questioning it. We forget we created it. We treat the invented threat as real. And slowly, without meaning to, we begin to live inside the lie. In politics, in religion, in relationships, people who spend years chasing enemies that don't exist. Fighting shadows, making themselves feel brave while hiding from the part of them that feels small, broken, unworthy. Because facing that is unbearable, so they don't. They export it. They make it someone else's fault. But you can't hide from the truth forever. At some point, it finds a way in. A comment, a moment, a silence, and the illusion cracks. Just for a second. You see it all clearly. The person you blamed, the lies you told yourself, the pain you avoided. And in that moment, you realize it was never about them. It was always about you. Not because you're evil, but because you're human. Because your mind is trying to protect you. The only way it knows how. Not with honesty, but with stories, with scapegoats, with devils that feel safer than the truth. And once you see that, everything changes. The enemies you feared begin to fade. The rage begins to quiet. And you're left with the thing you were trying not to feel. Shame, grief, regret. The truth you couldn't face. You might wish you could go back to the illusion. It felt easier, simpler, but you can't. Because now you know what it costs. You know the devil was never real. You were just trying not to see yourself.